Arizona Territory, 1873. The merciless summer sun beat down on the parched earth of Sagebrush Valley, a forgotten stretch of land where the Apache and white settlers waged their quiet war. Victor Macintyre wiped sweat from his brow as he surveyed the pitiful remains of what was once his father's dream, a cattle ranch carved from wilderness. At 25, with shoulders already bearing the weight of a failed inheritance, he stood alone amid the cracked earth, watching as the last muddy puddle in his cattle trough evaporated before his eyes. "Another day in paradise," he muttered, adjusting his worn Stetson. 6 months since his father's passing, and the drought had only worsened, transforming their modest success into a daily struggle against nature's cruelty. Victor had grown up believing that the frontier demanded solitude from a man. "The West takes more than it gives," his father had repeated like scripture. "Keep to yourself, trust no one but blood, and never show weakness." These words had shaped him into a man who viewed connection as vulnerability, a luxury no rancher could afford. The falsity of this belief had yet to reveal itself to Victor, who had built walls around his heart as sturdy as the corral fences he repaired each spring. His isolation was deliberate, his loneliness a choice made in service to survival. What use was companionship when the land demanded every ounce of strength just to make it through each season? His ranch, the Crooked M, sat precariously between civilization and wilderness, 10 miles from the settlement of Copper Springs. Once boasting 200 head of cattle, his herd had dwindled to barely 50, each animal growing leaner as the water sources dried up one by one. Victor led his exhausted mare, Penny, toward the barn. Her ribs showed through her dull coat, another reminder of his failing stewardship. The thought of riding another 15 miles to the creek for water left him bone-weary, but without it, tomorrow would bring death to his remaining livestock. "Just you and me against the world, girl," he said, patting her neck. The mare's listless response mirrored his own diminishing hope. As Victor unsaddled Penny, a distant rifle shot cracked the stillness. He froze, one hand instinctively moving to the Colt revolver at his hip. The Apache raids had increased with the drought, desperation driving both sides to violence. While other ranchers spoke of Indians with hatred and fear, Victor had always maintained a quiet neutrality. They were, after all, fighting for the same scarce resources, the same chance at survival. Victor secured Penny in her stall with the last handful of hay, then moved cautiously toward the house, a modest 2-room cabin with a porch that sagged in surrender to the elements. From this vantage point he could see dust rising in the distance, riders approaching from the east. The frontier had taught him vigilance. Friend or foe, preparation meant survival. Victor positioned himself behind the water barrel, nearly empty now, and waited, rifle in hand. As the riders drew closer, their identity became clear. Apache warriors, 5 of them, moving with purpose but not aggression. More troubling was what followed them, 2 women on foot, stumbling with exhaustion, hands bound before them. Victor's jaw tightened. Captives were not uncommon in these brutal borderlands. White settlers took Apache prisoners. Apache warriors took white captives. The cycle of vengeance spun endlessly, grinding humanity beneath its wheel. He had no quarrel with the Apache, but neither did he wish to become entangled in their affairs. He could retreat inside, bar the door, and pretend he had seen nothing. The small detachment would likely pass his property without incident. This was the prudent choice, the choice his father would have made. Yet as he watched the group slow near his boundary fence, Victor noticed something that turned prudence to ash in his mouth. One of the captives, a young woman with hair the color of wheat at harvest, collapsed to her knees. Even at this distance, her exhaustion was evident. The brave nearest to her yanked her roughly to her feet, but she swayed dangerously, clearly at the limits of her endurance. The second woman, older, with gray streaking her dark hair, called out something that was lost to the wind. An Apache warrior silenced her with a sharp gesture. Victor knew the signs of severe dehydration, the stumbling gait, the disorientation. These women would not survive another day's march without water. "Damn it all," he muttered, lowering his rifle. Self-preservation warred with the decency his mother had instilled in him before consumption had claimed her when he was just 12. "This is how men get killed, Ma." But he found himself stepping into view, hands raised to show peaceful intent. The Apache party halted immediately, rifles lifting in unison to target his chest. "I mean no harm," Victor called, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He had picked up enough Apache phrases over the years to communicate basic intent. "Water," he said in their language, pointing to his well. For all. The leader of the group, a warrior with a face weathered by sun and conflict, studied Victor with open suspicion. Victor recognized him vaguely. The man had been pointed out in town once, a subchief named Black Knife who was known for neither excessive cruelty nor particular mercy. Why would the white man offer water to his enemies? Black Knife asked in accented but clear English. Victor gestured to the captives. They need water, you need water, I have some to spare. This was not entirely true, every drop was precious, but he could not stand by and watch anyone die of thirst on his land, enemy or not. After a tense moment, Black Knife nodded sharply. The Apache approached cautiously, weapons ready. The captives were pushed forward, the younger one barely able to stand. Up close, Victor saw that she was younger than he had initially thought, perhaps 20 or 21, with remarkable violet-blue eyes that stood out in her dirt-smudged face. The well is there, Victor said, pointing to the stone structure at the side of the house. Help yourselves, but please leave enough for my cattle. While two warriors kept rifles trained on him, the others drew water. The captives were permitted to drink, the younger one so desperately that water spilled down her chin and neck, darkening the collar of her torn dress. As she finished drinking, the young woman's eyes met Victor's. Despite her circumstances, there was defiance there, a refusal to be broken. Something stirred in Victor's chest, admiration, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit who faced adversity with stubborn resistance. Thank you, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. Before Victor could respond, Black Knife approached him. You have shown unusual kindness, rancher. I will remember this. He gestured to his men, and they prepared to depart. Victor found himself unable to look away from the young woman as she was pulled back into line. Wait, he said suddenly, surprising himself as much as the Apache. Take more water for your journey. He reached for the canteens hanging by his door, offering them to Black Knife. And he hesitated, hardly believing his own recklessness. What do you want with these women? Black Knife's expression hardened. The elder woman has knowledge of healing that our people need. The younger one is her daughter. They will not be harmed if they cooperate. I could trade for them, Victor said, the words spilling out before wisdom could halt them. I have horses better than what you're riding. A dangerous silence followed his offer. Then unexpectedly Black Knife laughed. You wish to buy these white women. For what purpose, rancher? You are alone here. Victor felt heat rise in his face. I only meant to ensure their safety. Black Knife studied him with shrewd eyes. The young one interests you. I see it in your face. He glanced at the woman in question, then back to Victor. What is your name, rancher? Victor Macintyre. Black Knife nodded slowly. The Apache have no quarrel with Victor Macintyre, who offers water to enemies. But these women have value to my people. He paused, then added, perhaps we can reach an agreement that benefits both our peoples. Hope flickered in Victor's chest, though he struggled to keep it from showing on his face. What kind of agreement? Our hunting grounds to the north have been taken by white settlers. Game grows scarce, my people hunger. Victor understood immediately. You need food. I have cattle. 2 fat steers delivered to the Red Mesa each month until the winter rains come, Black Knife said. In exchange, the healing woman works with our medicine man for 3 moons, then both women go free. The older woman's expression changed to one of cautious hope. We would be treated well, she asked. Black Knife nodded. With respect if you share your knowledge freely. Victor calculated quickly. 2 steers a month would strain his already struggling ranch, but it was a price he was willing to pay. The alternative, leaving these women to an uncertain fate, was unthinkable. 3 moons, Victor agreed, but I want your word that no harm will come to either of them. The word of an Apache means nothing to white men, Black Knife said coldly. It means something to this white man, Victor replied. Something like respect flickered in the warrior's eyes. Then you have it, the women will not be harmed. He turned to his men, giving instructions in their native tongue. The captives' bonds were cut. The younger woman rubbed her wrists, disbelief evident on her face. Why would you do this? She asked Victor. You don't know us. Victor had no answer that made sense, even to himself. He had spent years believing that survival on the frontier meant isolation, that connections were liabilities. Yet here he stood, trading away precious resources for strangers. No decent man leaves women to suffer if he can prevent it, he said finally, though the words felt insufficient. The older woman stepped forward. I am Alina O'Brien. This is my daughter Mariposa. Her eyes held gratitude and wariness in equal measure. We will not forget this kindness, Mr. Macintyre. Mariposa O'Brien. The name suited her, Victor thought, noting how even exhausted and disheveled, she possessed an innate grace, like the butterfly she was named after. The agreement is made, Black Knife declared. The women will stay with my people at the summer camp near Cloud Creek. You will bring the first cattle in 3 days. He mounted his horse, gesturing for his warriors to do the same. Wait, Mariposa said suddenly. She turned to Victor, urgency in her expression. Our homestead north of here. Could you send word to my brother Thomas? He'll be searching for us. Victor nodded. I'll find him. The O'Brien place about 20 miles north along Cottonwood Creek, she added. With that, the party departed, leaving Victor standing alone in his yard, wondering what madness had possessed him. 2 steers a month was a steep price, one that might well break him before the drought ended. And for what? The conscience-seizing knowledge that he had helped 2 strangers. As he watched them disappear into the distance, Victor tried to convince himself that he had acted out of simple human decency. Yet the memory of Mariposa O'Brien's violet-blue eyes tugged at something deeper, something he had long denied existed within him, a longing for connection that persisted despite years of deliberate isolation. Fool, he muttered to himself as he returned to the barn. The frontier is no place for sentiment. But as he prepared to ride to the O'Brien homestead, Victor found himself recalling his mother's favorite saying. Even in the harshest wilderness, Victor, it is our connections to others that truly keep us alive. For the first time in many years, he wondered if his father's philosophy of isolation might be wrong, and what it might cost him to find out. The O'Brien homestead stood silent and watchful against the approaching dusk when Victor arrived the following day. The journey had been grueling, 20 miles through unforgiving terrain, with only his troubled thoughts for company. A modest cabin with a sturdy barn and corral told the story of a family working hard to establish themselves in this untamed country. Victor dismounted carefully, aware that a stranger approaching at dusk might receive a bullet before questions. Hello, the house, he called. I bring news of Alina and Mariposa O'Brien. The front door burst open almost immediately. A young man of perhaps 20 emerged, rifle raised, face taut with suspicion and hope. Who are you? Where are they? Victor Macintyre, I own the Crooked M Ranch south of here. Victor kept his hands visible. Your sister asked me to find you. The rifle lowered slightly. Thomas O'Brien, are they alive? Victor nodded. They were taken by Apache 2 days ago. They're unharmed. He quickly explained the agreement he'd made with Black Knife. Thomas lowered his rifle completely, disbelief and gratitude warring on his face. You traded cattle for their safety. Why would you do that for strangers? It was the second time Victor had been asked this question, and he still had no satisfactory answer. It seemed the right thing to do. Thomas studied him for a long moment, then gestured toward the house. Come inside, Mr. Macintyre. Sounds like I owe you more than a thank you. The interior of the cabin was simple but well kept, with touches that spoke of Alina O'Brien's efforts to create a home. Handmade curtains, a braided rug, shelves lined with books. Family belongings that had likely traveled west in a wagon, carrying memories of a different life. As Thomas prepared coffee, Victor learned that the O'Briens had come from Pennsylvania a year earlier after losing their patriarch to a mining accident. Alina, a skilled herbalist and midwife, had convinced her children that the frontier offered a fresh start. Thomas had taken to ranching with natural ability, while Mariposa managed their garden and helped her mother with her healing work. Mari's stubborn as they come, Thomas said with obvious affection. Been turning down suitors since she was 16, says she won't marry until she finds a man who values her mind as much as her face. He shook his head. 20 years old and already knows her own mind better than most folks twice her age. Victor found himself unexpectedly interested in these details about Mariposa O'Brien. The image of her defiant eyes amid her captivity made more sense now. What happens now? Thomas asked, setting a steaming cup before Victor. I deliver 2 steers to the Apache in 3 days and every month until the rains come. After 3 months, your mother and sister go free. Thomas frowned. That's a heavy burden for your ranch to bear, especially in drought. Let me share it. Victor started to refuse out of habit. He had always handled his problems alone, but stopped himself. His cattle were already lean from poor grazing. Thomas's offer made practical sense. "One steer from each of us, then," Victor agreed. "We'll deliver them together." Relief flashed across Thomas's face. "I'd like to see them, make sure they're really all right." "Black Knife gave his word they wouldn't be harmed," Victor said. "But I understand your concern. We can ask to speak with them when we deliver the cattle." They spent the evening planning the delivery and sharing what information each had about the Apache in the region. As the night deepened, Thomas offered Victor a place to sleep rather than making the dangerous return journey in darkness. Lying on a borrowed bedroll, Victor found himself thinking of Mariposa O'Brien, not just her striking eyes, but the strength she displayed in her moment of greatest vulnerability. In his 25 years, he had known few women beyond passing acquaintances in town. His father's insistence that attachments were dangerous had kept him from pursuing anything deeper. Yet now, having acted against those long-held beliefs by intervening in the O'Brien's fate, Victor felt something shifting inside him, a questioning of truths he had accepted without examination. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, he dreamed of violet blue eyes and the unexpected path his life had taken with one impulsive act of mercy. 3 days later, Victor and Thomas approached the Red Mesa with 2 steers in tow. The journey had been tense, each man lost in his own thoughts about what awaited them. The Apache camp came into view gradually, lodges arranged in a protective circle, smoke rising from cooking fires. Warriors met them before they reached the camp proper, silent and watchful. Victor recognized one from their previous encounter, who nodded slightly in acknowledgement. "We bring cattle as agreed," Victor said. "We would like to see the women." The warriors conferred briefly, then led them into camp where Black Knife awaited. The Apache leader inspected the cattle with approval. "You honor our agreement, Victor Macintyre," he said. "This is good." "The women?" Thomas asked, anxiety evident in his voice. Black Knife gestured toward a lodge near the center of camp. "They work with our medicine woman." "They are well." As if summoned by the conversation, Eleanor O'Brien emerged from the lodge, looking tired but unharmed. Her face brightened at the sight of her son. "Thomas," she called, hurrying toward them. They embraced while Victor scanned the area for Mariposa. "Your sister is gathering plants with 2 hawks," Eleanor explained, seeing his searching look. "She's well, just busy. The Apache have been respectful." She turned to Victor, grasping his hand warmly. "Mr. Macintyre, I cannot thank you enough for what you've done." "It was nothing," Victor said, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "It was everything," Eleanor corrected gently. "Few men would have interfered, fewer still would have offered their livelihood to help strangers." Before Victor could respond, he noticed a figure approaching from the edge of camp. Mariposa O'Brien walked alongside an elderly Apache woman, a basket of plants cradled in her arms. She looked transformed from the desperate captive he had met days earlier, her golden hair neatly braided, her face washed clean, wearing a simple dress that appeared to be of Apache making. When she spotted them, her pace quickened. "Thomas," she called, handing the basket to her companion before embracing her brother. "Are you truly all right, Mari?" Thomas asked, holding her at arm's length to examine her. "I am," she assured him. "They need mother's knowledge badly. Their children have been dying from a sickness she believes she can treat." She turned to Victor, her expression softening. "Mr. Macintyre, you kept your word." Something in her gaze made Victor acutely aware of his trail-worn appearance. "Miss O'Brien," he managed, "you look recovered." A small smile touched her lips. "Much improved, yes." She glanced at Black Knife, who watched their interaction with interest. "The Apache have been honorable in their treatment. Mother has already helped several children, and they're teaching me about plants I've never seen before." Victor was struck by her resilience, her ability to find value in her circumstances rather than surrendering to fear or resentment. It was a quality he had rarely encountered. "We brought food as well," Thomas said, indicating the packs on their horses, "things we thought you might need." "That was thoughtful," Mariposa said, "though we're managing well enough." "The Apache share what they have." After arranging details for the next cattle delivery, the men prepared to depart. As they mounted their horses, Mariposa approached Victor's side. "Mr. Macintyre," she said quietly, "I still don't understand why you did this for us, but but I want you to know I'll find a way to repay your kindness someday." Victor looked down at her, struck anew by the determination in her expression. "There's no debt, Miss O'Brien." "Nevertheless," she insisted, "the O'Briens pay what they owe." She reached up and pressed something into his hand, a small leather pouch, "for your journey home. A tea that helps with weariness." Their fingers brushed briefly, and Victor felt an unexpected jolt at the contact. "Thank you," he said, suddenly finding it difficult to maintain his usual reserve. As they rode away, Thomas glanced at him curiously. "My sister seems to have made an impression on you." Victor tucked the pouch into his saddlebag. "She's not what I expected." "Mari never is," Thomas said with a laugh. "Been surprising folks her whole life." The ride back was filled with Thomas's stories of his sister's stubbornness and intelligence, how she had taught herself botany from their mother's books, how she had once faced down a group of miners who had tried to intimidate her brother, how she wrote poetry that she thought no one knew about. Each anecdote painted a more complete picture of Mariposa O'Brien, one that Victor found increasingly compelling. Her courage and independence reminded him of his mother, who had maintained her gentleness and optimism despite the frontier's harshness. It was a comparison that both attracted and unsettled him. That night, camped halfway between the mesa and their ranches, Victor brewed the tea Mariposa had given him. Its earthy aroma filled the air as he sipped the bitter liquid. "Mari has a way with remedies," Thomas commented. "Learned it all from our mother." "It's good," Victor admitted, feeling the tension easing from his muscles. Thomas studied him across the campfire. "You know, Macintyre, when you first showed up at our door, I couldn't figure why a stranger would risk so much for people he didn't know. Still not sure I understand it completely." Victor stared into the flames. "Neither do I," he admitted. "It wasn't planned." "Well, planned or not, you made friends for life with the O'Briens." Thomas poked at the fire thoughtfully. "And maybe something else, from the way Mari looked at you." Victor felt heat rise to his face that had nothing to do with the fire. "Your sister was just being gracious." Thomas chuckled. "I've seen Mari gracious." "That wasn't it." He wrapped himself in his blanket, effectively ending the conversation. "Sleep well, Macintyre. We've a long ride tomorrow." Victor remained awake long after Thomas began snoring softly. The tea had indeed eased his physical weariness, but his mind was restless, filled with thoughts of violet blue eyes and the strange new feelings stirring within him. Feelings that contradicted everything his father had taught him about survival on the frontier. For the first time in years, Victor wondered if there might be more to life than mere endurance, if perhaps connection, rather than isolation, was the true path to thriving in this harsh land. It was a dangerous thought, one that threatened the foundations of his carefully constructed solitude. Yet as sleep finally claimed him, Victor found himself looking forward to the next cattle delivery with an anticipation that had nothing to do with honoring agreements. The weeks passed in a rhythm dictated by drought and obligation. Victor and Thomas delivered cattle regularly, each visit allowing brief conversations with Alina and Mariposa. Despite the circumstances, a tentative friendship formed between the four of them, born of shared purpose and growing mutual respect. During these visits, Victor observed Mariposa's gradual integration into the temporary life she had been forced to accept. She moved among the Apache with increasing confidence, learning their language and customs while assisting her mother's healing work. Her adaptive nature impressed him, so different from the rigid resistance many settlers showed toward native ways. On their fourth delivery, they arrived to find the camp in celebration. Children raced between lodges while women prepared an abundance of food. Black Knife greeted them with unusual warmth. "The sickness that took our children has been defeated," he explained. "Thanks to the healing woman and her daughter." Alina emerged from a nearby lodge, looking tired but satisfied. "The last child's fever broke this morning," she told them. "We've finally found the right combination of treatments." "Where's Mariposa?" Thomas asked, scanning the busy camp. "Sleeping," Alina said. "She's been up 3 nights straight helping tend the sick children," pride shone in her eyes. "She has a gift, that girl." Victor felt a surge of admiration. While he had been struggling with his ranch and drought, Mariposa had been saving lives. Later, as they shared a meal with the tribe, Mariposa joined them, her face still soft with sleep. She smiled when she saw Victor, a genuine warmth that made his chest tighten unexpectedly. "Mr. Macintyre," she said, settling beside him on a blanket, "I'm sorry I wasn't awake to greet you properly." "Your mother told us you've been busy," he replied. "And successful." She nodded, accepting a bowl of stew from an Apache woman. It was touch and go for a while. The youngest child, Sparrow, nearly didn't make it. She glanced toward a small boy playing nearby, but he's recovering now. Victor watched her interact with the Apache women, switching effortlessly between English and their language. "You've learned their tongue quickly. Mother always said understanding comes before healing." She tucked a stray golden strand behind her ear. "Besides, they have much to teach if one is willing to listen." "Not many settlers would see it that way," Victor observed. Mariposa's expression grew serious. "Most settlers see only enemies or obstacles. They miss the knowledge that could help us all survive here." She studied him curiously. "You're different, though. You offered water to your so-called enemies." "Maybe I'm just practical," Victor said, uncomfortable with her assessment. "Dead neighbors, white or Apache, solve nothing." "Is that truly all it was?" Practicality, her violet blue eyes seemed to see through his defenses. Before Victor could formulate a response, Black Knife approached them. "Victor Macintyre," he said formally. "The council wishes to speak with you." Puzzled, Victor followed the Apache leader to where several elders had gathered. With Thomas translating where necessary, they expressed their gratitude for both the cattle deliveries and the healing work of the O'Brien women. "We have discussed the arrangement," Black Knife said finally. "The healing woman has done more for our people than we expected. Her knowledge has saved many lives." Victor nodded, uncertain where this was leading. "We agreed she would stay 3 moons," Black Knife continued. "But we now feel this debt has been repaid sooner than expected. When you return next time, the women will be free to leave with you." The news was unexpected but welcome. Victor thanked them sincerely, relieved that the O'Briens would soon be safely home. Yet as he returned to share the news with Mariposa and Alina, he felt a curious hollow sensation in his chest at the thought that these regular visits would soon end. When told of the council's decision, Alina expressed gratitude, but Mariposa's reaction was more complex. Relief mingled with something like regret in her expression. "I've learned so much here," she said quietly. "Things I could never have learned elsewhere." "You can continue learning," her mother assured her. "We'll maintain the relationships we've built." As they prepared to depart, Mariposa walked with Victor to where the horses were tethered. "Will you come with Thomas for the final delivery?" she asked. "Of course," Victor replied, surprised by the question. "I gave my word." She nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Good, I have something to show you then." "Something important." The mysterious promise lingered in Victor's thoughts during the long ride home, eclipsing even the good news about the O'Briens' impending release. Thomas noticed his distraction but misinterpreted it. "Don't worry about the ranch," he said. "Once Mari and Mother are back, things will get easier. Mari's a hard worker, and Mother's remedies might help your cattle through the drought." Victor nodded absently, realizing he hadn't thought about his struggling ranch in hours. A concerning lapse for a man whose entire identity had been built around survival and self-reliance. Back at the Crooked M, the reality of his situation came rushing back. The drought showed no signs of breaking, and his reduced herd grew thinner by the day. The well was dangerously low, and without rain soon, even basic survival would become questionable. Yet as he worked through the grueling daily tasks, Victor found his thoughts repeatedly drifting to Mariposa O'Brien. Her intelligence, her adaptability, her unexpected smiles. He caught himself wondering what she might think of his modest home if she would see potential where he had only seen struggle. These thoughts alarmed him. His father's warnings echoed in his memory. "Attachment is weakness, boy." In the West, a man survives by depending on himself alone. But for the first time, Victor found himself questioning whether survival alone was enough. The O'Briens, despite their hardships, seemed to possess something his isolated existence lacked, a sense of purpose beyond mere endurance, a richness that came from shared experience rather than solitary perseverance. As the day for the final delivery approached, Victor found himself taking unprecedented care with his appearance, trimming his beard, mending tears in his best shirt. He told himself it was simply respect for the occasion, but the explanation rang hollow even to his own ears. The truth, unwelcome as it was, had become increasingly difficult to deny. Mariposa O'Brien had awakened something in him that he had long believed dead or non-existent, a yearning for connection that transcended his father's pragmatic philosophy. This realization filled him with both anticipation and dread as he rode toward the O'Brien homestead to meet Thomas for their final journey to the Apache camp. For a man who had always charted his course by the fixed star of self-reliance, these new feelings represented dangerous, uncharted waters, a wilderness more threatening than any physical landscape he had ever traversed. The Apache camp was subdued when they arrived, as if the coming departure of the O'Brien women had cast a shadow over the community. Children who had grown attached to Mariposa followed her as she moved through her final day among them, their expressions solemn despite her cheerful reassurances. Eleanor had prepared packets of medicine and detailed instructions for the tribe's medicine woman, determined that her absence would not undo the progress they had made against illness. The Apache women gathered around her, absorbing her final lessons with intense concentration. Thomas was quickly absorbed into these farewell activities, helping his mother organize her supplies and translations. Victor stood awkwardly at the periphery, uncertain of his place in these proceedings until Mariposa approached him. "You came," she said simply. "I said I would." Victor found himself suddenly aware of every imperfection in his appearance, the trail dust on his boots, the sunburn across his nose. Mariposa studied him for a moment, then said, "I need to show you something. Will you come with me?" She led him away from the camp, following a narrow trail that wound through juniper and sage toward a nearby ridge. They walked in companionable silence, Victor acutely conscious of her presence beside him. "The Apache believe this place is sacred," Mariposa explained as they climbed. "A place where the spirits speak to those who listen." The trail crested the ridge, revealing a breathtaking view of the valley below. From this vantage point, the parched landscape transformed into something almost beautiful, golden grasses swaying in the breeze, distant mountains turned purple by haze, the meandering line of a mostly dry creek bed cutting through it all. Mariposa settled on a sun-warmed boulder, gesturing for Victor to join her. "Look there," she said, pointing toward a distant section of the valley. "What do you see?" Victor narrowed his eyes against the glare. "Just more drought-stricken land." "Look closer, the vegetation near that bend in the creek." He studied the area more carefully, noticing a subtle difference, a patch of greener growth amid the brown. "Some plants are surviving better there." "Not just surviving, thriving," Mariposa corrected. "Two hawks showed me this place last week. There's an underground spring feeding that section, one that doesn't dry up even in the worst droughts." Her eyes lit with excitement. "The Apache have known about it for generations, but they've kept it secret from settlers." Victor's mind raced with implications. A reliable water source even in drought. "It's on unclaimed land," Mariposa continued. "Land that touches your northern boundary." She turned to face him fully. "The Apache are showing us this because of what you did, offering water when they were your enemies. Black Knife says balance must be maintained, life for life, water for water." Victor stared at the distant green patch, hardly daring to believe what she was telling him. A dependable water source would transform his struggling ranch, making survival possible even in the harshest conditions. "Why are you showing me this?" he asked, turning to meet her gaze. "Because you saved us," Mariposa said simply. "And because," she hesitated, a flush coloring her cheeks, "because in these past weeks I've come to care what happens to you." The admission hung between them, honest and unadorned. Victor found himself at a loss for words, unaccustomed to such directness, especially regarding matters of feeling. "Miss O'Brien, Mariposa," he began awkwardly, "I'm not sure what to say." "You don't need to say anything," she assured him quickly. "I know we've had little time to truly know each other. I just wanted you to understand why this information was entrusted to me to share with you." But it wasn't so simple. These weeks of brief encounters had affected Victor more deeply than he cared to admit. This woman, with her intelligence and resilience, her ability to find beauty and opportunity in hardship, had begun to dismantle the walls he had built around his heart. "I've come to care what happens to you, too," he admitted, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "More than I expected, more than is probably wise." Mariposa's eyes widened slightly, then softened with understanding. "Is caring ever truly wise, Mr. Macintyre? especially out here where tomorrow is never guaranteed. My father would say no, Victor said. He believed connections made a man vulnerable, that the frontier demanded complete self-reliance. And what do you believe? She asked quietly. The question struck at the heart of the conflict that had been growing within him, between his father's harsh philosophy and the new possibilities that had begun to take root since that fateful day when he'd offered water to his enemies. I'm beginning to think he was wrong, Victor said slowly. That perhaps it's not weakness to need others, but a different kind of strength. Mariposa smiled, the expression transforming her face with a warmth that reached her remarkable eyes. I believe that too. They sat in silence for a moment, the admission creating a fragile bridge between them. Then Mariposa reached into her pocket and withdrew a small cloth-wrapped package. I made this for you, she said, handing it to him. A thank you, though it hardly seems adequate. Victor unwrapped the gift carefully to reveal an intricately beaded leather amulet on a cord. It's beautiful, he said, running his finger over the precise patterning. The Apache women taught me their beadwork, Mariposa explained. This pattern represents water, life-giving, persistent, finding paths through even the hardest stone. She gestured toward the distant spring. Like you did when you saw a way to help strangers despite the cost to yourself. The parallels were not lost on Victor. He slipped the cord over his head, feeling the weight of the amulet settle against his chest. Thank you. I'll treasure it. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of possibilities neither had anticipated when their paths first crossed. The moment was broken by a distant call, Thomas, summoning them back to camp for the departure. Reality reasserted itself as they made their way down the ridge, the comfortable silence now charged with unresolved questions. The farewells at camp were emotional, with Apache children clinging to Mariposa and women embracing a leaner with genuine affection. Black Knife presented Thomas with a finely crafted hunting bow, and to Victor, he offered a leather map marking the location of the hidden spring. Water is life, the Apache leader said simply. You gave water to enemies, now we give water to a friend. As they prepared to depart, Victor found himself unexpectedly moved by the genuine connections the O'Briens had formed in what had begun as captivity. It challenged everything he had been taught about the unbridgeable divisions between settlers and natives. The journey back to the O'Brien homestead was filled with animated conversation as Alina and Mariposa shared stories of their time with the Apache, the knowledge they had gained, and their plans to incorporate these learnings into their healing work. Victor rode slightly apart, watching Mariposa's animated expressions as she described a birthing ritual she had witnessed. Her capacity for finding value in experiences that others would consider only hardship continued to impress him. It was a quality his mother had possessed, the ability to see beauty amid struggle, opportunity within challenge. When they reached the O'Brien homestead, the women's joy at returning home was palpable. Thomas insisted that Victor stay for a celebration dinner, and he found himself unable to refuse, drawn by the warmth of their family dynamic. As Alina prepared a meal from their stored provisions, Mariposa showed Victor their small but thriving garden, explaining the medicinal properties of various plants she cultivated. You have a gift for making things grow, Victor observed, watching her gentle handling of a fragile seedling. My mother says I was born with dirt under my fingernails, Mariposa laughed. I've always felt most at home helping things thrive against the odds. She glanced at him curiously. What about you? What makes you feel most alive? The question caught him off guard. For years, his focus had been mere survival, keeping the ranch going, honoring his father's legacy. The idea of pursuits that brought joy rather than just sustenance seemed almost foreign. I suppose, seeing the land respond to careful stewardship, he said after consideration. Watching a good plan work out despite nature's challenges. Mariposa nodded, a creator then building something from nothing, she smiled. We have that in common. The dinner that followed was unlike any meal Victor had experienced in years, not for its content, which was simple frontier fare, but for the atmosphere of shared stories and genuine laughter. The O'Briens included him effortlessly in their family circle, drawing him out with questions and listening with real interest to his responses. As evening deepened, Thomas produced a bottle of whiskey saved for special occasions, and they toasted to safe returns and new friendships. Victor found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't since his mother's death, the rigid self-containment he had practiced for years softening in the warmth of their company. When it came time to leave, Mariposa walked him to where Penny waited. The night was clear, stars scattered across the vast sky like diamonds on black velvet. "Will you come to dinner again?" she asked, her directness unchanged by their return to civilization. "Perhaps Sunday after church." Victor hesitated, old habits of isolation warring with his growing desire for connection. "I'd like that," he said finally. "Thank you." "Good." Mariposa's smile was visible even in the dim starlight. "And perhaps you could show us this hidden spring. I'd like to see what plants grow there naturally." "Of course," Victor mounted Penny, feeling strangely reluctant to leave. "Sunday, then." As he rode toward home, Victor found his thoughts in uncharacteristic disorder. The foundation of his worldview, that isolation was necessary for survival on the frontier, had been shaken by his experiences of the past weeks. The O'Briens, despite their hardships, seemed to have discovered a truth that had eluded him. That human connections, rather than being liabilities, could be wellsprings of strength in this harsh land. And Mariposa, her image persisted in his mind, not just her beauty, which was undeniable, but her spirit, her intelligence, her unique way of engaging with the world. She represented possibilities he had never allowed himself to consider. Back at the Crooked M, Victor removed the beaded amulet and studied it in the lamplight. The intricate pattern seemed to contain a message beyond its surface meaning, a reminder that like water, life found unexpected paths, creating beauty and sustenance in the most unlikely places. For the first time in years, Victor Macintyre fell asleep with a sense of anticipation rather than resignation, a feeling that his life's course, long confined to the narrow channel of survival, might be opening into something broader and more meaningful than he had ever dared to imagine. Sunday arrived with a clarity that seemed symbolic, the harsh summer glare softened by the first hints of autumn, the morning air carrying a promise of eventual relief from the relentless heat. Victor dressed with uncharacteristic care, selecting his seldom-worn church clothes and taking extra time with his shaving. The church in Copper Springs was a simple wooden structure, unassuming but well-maintained by a community that valued the weekly gathering as much for social connection as for spiritual guidance. Victor usually avoided these gatherings, uncomfortable with the forced sociability, but today he found himself scanning the assembled townspeople for a glimpse of golden hair. The O'Briens arrived just before the service began, causing a stir of interest. Their ordeal with the Apache had become known throughout the small community, and curious glances followed them as they took seats near the back. Victor nodded a greeting, receiving a warm smile from Mariposa that seemed to cut through the formality of the occasion. After the service, while congregants lingered to socialize, several townspeople approached the O'Briens, eager for first-hand accounts of their time with the Apache. Victor watched from a distance as Mariposa fielded questions with gracious patience, though he noted how she carefully reframed hostile assumptions about their captors into more nuanced descriptions. "Quite a story, Macintyre." The voice belonged to Sheriff Dawson, a gruff but fair-minded man who had known Victor's father. "Heard you had something to do with getting them back." Victor shrugged. "Just helped with the negotiations." Dawson studied him with shrewd eyes. "Must have been more than that. Word is you traded good cattle for them, in a drought no less." He glanced toward Mariposa. "Course, looking at Miss O'Brien, maybe I understand your motivation better." Heat rose to Victor's face. "It wasn't like that." "No offense meant," Dawson chuckled. "Just noting that she's turned quite a few heads since arriving last year." "Turned them all down flat, though." He clapped Victor on the shoulder. "Good to see you in town for a change. Your father always said isolation makes a man strange. Glad you're proving him wrong on that count, at least." Before Victor could respond to this unexpected insight into his father's thinking, Eleanor O'Brien approached them. "Mr. Macintyre," she said warmly, "we were hoping you'd join us for the ride home." The invitation rescued him from further conversation with the perceptive sheriff. Victor made his excuses and followed Eleanor to where Thomas and Mariposa waited with their wagon and horses. The ride to the O'Brien homestead was pleasant, the conversation flowing easily between topics ranging from town gossip to the conditions of local grazing lands. Victor found himself more engaged than he had been in social interaction for years, drawn out of his habitual reserve by the O'Brien's genuine interest. At the homestead, Alina immediately set about preparing dinner while Thomas tended to the livestock. Mariposa invited Victor to see the improvements they'd made to their garden during her absence, clearly proud of how her brother had maintained it. "Thomas says you might show us the hidden spring today," she said as they walked among the neat rows of vegetables and herbs. Victor nodded. "If you'd like, it's about an hour's ride from here." "I would like that very much," Mariposa said, her excitement evident. "Mother's been talking about expanding our medicinal garden, and a reliable water source would make all the difference." Alina's dinner was simple but delicious. Roast chicken with vegetables from their garden, fresh-baked bread, and an apple pie that reminded Victor of childhood meals before his mother's passing. The conversation around the table had an easy familiarity that both comforted and disoriented him. So long had it been since he'd experienced such communion. After the meal, Victor and Mariposa prepared to ride to the spring, while Alina and Thomas remained behind to finish some necessary chores. As they mounted their horses, Victor couldn't help noticing how naturally Mariposa sat her mount, handling the spirited mare with confident ease. "You ride well," he observed as they set out. "Father taught me when I was barely big enough to reach the stirrups," she replied with a smile. "Said a frontier woman needs to ride as well as any man." The mention of her father brought a momentary shadow to her expression. He would have loved it here, despite the challenges. "Tell me about him," Victor found himself asking, genuinely interested in understanding more about her history. As they rode across the golden landscape, Mariposa shared stories of her father, a mining engineer with an adventurous spirit who had taught his children to see possibilities where others saw only obstacles. His death in a mine collapse had devastated the family, but also inspired their westward journey, a fulfillment of his long-held dream. "He always said we were meant for bigger skies," Mariposa explained. "When he died, Mother decided his vision shouldn't die with him." Her expression grew thoughtful. "I think that's why our time with the Apache affected me so deeply. They understand living in harmony with this land in ways we're still learning." Victor found himself sharing his own history in return. His mother's gentle influence, his father's harsh but well-intentioned lessons, the lonely years after their passing as he struggled to maintain their legacy. "Your father believed isolation was necessary for survival," Mariposa observed. "Yet you risked everything to help strangers." "I'm beginning to think he was wrong about many things," Victor admitted. "Or perhaps the world he understood is changing." They crested a rise, and Victor pointed ahead to where a subtle change in vegetation marked their destination. "There, you can see where the land starts to green." As they approached the hidden spring, the transformation became more apparent. Amid the drought-stricken terrain, this pocket of vitality stood out like an emerald set in dull stone. A small seep emerged from between rocks, creating a modest pool before disappearing underground again, its presence marked by the lush growth surrounding it. Mariposa dismounted eagerly, moving toward the water with reverence. "It's beautiful," she breathed, kneeling to examine the plants growing at the water's edge. "Look at these, medicinal varieties I haven't seen since Pennsylvania." Victor watched her enthusiasm with growing warmth in his chest. Her genuine appreciation for the natural world, her ability to see beauty and potential where others might note only resources, resonated deeply with a part of himself he had long suppressed in the name of practical survival. "The Apache showed great trust in sharing this with you," Mariposa said, looking up at him. "They believe water sources are sacred, connections to the underworld where spirits dwell." "I'm not sure I deserved such trust," Victor said, settling beside her on a sun-warmed rock. "I only did what seemed right at the time." Mariposa studied him with those remarkable violet blue eyes. "Perhaps that's precisely why they trusted you. Genuine kindness is rare enough to be recognized when it appears." She dipped her fingers in the cool water. "Do you know what you'll do with this knowledge?" It was a question Victor had contemplated extensively since learning of the spring. "I thought to dig a channel to my grazing land," he said slowly. "But after seeing it," he gestured to the miniature oasis, "it seems wrong to disturb something that has found its own balance." Approval flickered in Mariposa's expression. "Perhaps there's a middle way. A small diversion that leaves the main spring intact." Her practical mind engaged with the problem. "We could create a secondary garden here, medicinal plants that need consistent water." Share the bounty rather than redirecting it entirely. We, Victor questioned, noting her choice of words. A flush colored her cheeks. I only meant as neighbors we could collaborate. Your land, my knowledge of plants. She tucked a strand of golden hair behind her ear, a gesture Victor had come to recognize as a sign of nervousness. Unless you'd prefer to develop it alone. No, Victor said quickly, surprised by the intensity of his response. No, I like the idea of collaboration. The word felt significant, an acknowledgement of a shift in his thinking from solitary survival to shared possibility. They spent the next hour exploring the area around the spring, Mariposa identifying plants with potential medicinal value while Victor assessed the practical aspects of limited water diversion. Their discussion flowed easily between botanical knowledge and ranching practicalities, each contributing expertise the other lacked. As the afternoon light began to soften toward evening, they reluctantly prepared to return to the O'Brien homestead. Mounting their horses, Victor found himself reluctant for the day to end. Would you consider visiting the Crooked M sometime, he asked suddenly, to see where the water might best be used? Mariposa's smile held genuine pleasure. I'd like that very much, perhaps later this week. Thursday, Victor suggested. I could show you the ranch such as it is. Thursday it is, she agreed. The ride back was companionable, their conversation ranging from practical plans for the spring to broader thoughts about frontier life. Victor found himself more relaxed in Mariposa's presence than he could remember being with anyone in years. The rigid self-containment he had practiced so long gradually yielding to something more open. At the O'Brien homestead, Thomas and Alina greeted them with interest, eager to hear about the spring. As Mariposa described their findings and the possibilities they had discussed, Victor observed the family's dynamics, the easy affection, the respectful attention they gave each other's thoughts, the unquestioned support. It was so different from his solitary existence that it created an ache of longing he hadn't expected. When it came time for him to depart, Mariposa walked him to his horse. The evening light cast her golden hair in a warm glow, softening her features. Thank you for today, she said, for sharing the spring and for listening to my probably overambitious ideas. They weren't overambitious, Victor assured her. They were insightful. He hesitated, then added, I've enjoyed today more than any day I can remember in a long time. The admission felt dangerous in its honesty, but Mariposa's response, a smile that reached her eyes, eased his concern. As have I, she said simply, until Thursday then. Victor mounted Penny, acutely aware of Mariposa's gaze following him as he rode away. The unfamiliar feeling of anticipation followed him home, disrupting his usual evening routine with thoughts of violet blue eyes and practical suggestions delivered in a voice that had begun to feel like music to his ears. Alone in his cabin that night, Victor found himself questioning the foundations upon which he had built his adult life. His father's insistence that connection was vulnerability, that isolation was the price of frontier survival, seemed increasingly hollow when measured against the warmth and resilience he had witnessed in the O'Brien family. The beaded amulet Mariposa had given him caught the lamplight as it hung from a nail beside his bed. Like water finding paths through stone, new possibilities were carving channels through his long-held beliefs, creating space for something he had never thought to seek on the frontier, not just survival, but a life worth the struggle to sustain it. Thursday arrived with unexpected developments that threatened to derail Victor's plans. A section of fencing on his northern boundary had failed during the night, allowing several head of cattle to wander onto unclaimed land. The morning was spent in dusty, frustrating labor, retrieving the animals and making temporary repairs with inadequate materials. By midday, when Mariposa was expected to arrive, Victor was sweat-soaked and filthy, his mood darkened by the constant reminders of his ranch's precarious state. He had just returned the last stray to the corral when he spotted a rider approaching, Mariposa, arriving exactly when promised. Victor ran a hand through his dust-caked hair, acutely conscious of his appearance. Miss O'Brien, he called, walking to meet her. I apologize for my state, had some trouble with the north fence. Mariposa dismounted gracefully, seemingly unconcerned by his disheveled condition. No apologies needed, mister. Macintyre ranch work waits for no one, she smiled, taking in his property with interest. So this is the Crooked M. Victor followed her gaze, suddenly seeing his home through outside eyes. The weathered cabin with its sagging porch, the barn that needed painting, the sparse grazing land where his reduced herd sought sustenance among drought-stunted grass. It was a far cry from what his father had envisioned, and Victor felt a flush of something like shame. "It's seen better days," he admitted. "It has good bones," Mariposa observed, her tone appreciative rather than pitying. "And clearly a dedicated caretaker." She nodded toward the newly repaired fence. "Would you show me around?" Her genuine interest eased his discomfort. Victor led her through the modest ranch, explaining its history and the challenges of maintaining it through years of inconsistent rainfall. Mariposa listened attentively, asking questions that revealed both practical knowledge and genuine curiosity. In the barn, she admired Penny and the few other horses Victor had managed to keep healthy despite the drought. "You've done well by them," she noted, running a knowledgeable hand along a mare's flank. "Many ranchers would have sold these horses by now." "My mother loved horses," Victor explained. "Could never bring myself to part with them, even when it might have been practical." Mariposa's expression softened. "Sometimes the impractical choices reveal our truest selves." She gestured toward the cabin. "May I see inside?" Victor hesitated. No one besides himself had entered the cabin in over a year. It was tidy enough but Spartan, revealing in its stark simplicity the solitary nature of his existence. "It's nothing special," he warned, leading the way. The cabin's interior was clean but austere. A sturdy table with 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, shelves with practical necessities, and a narrow bed in the corner. The only decorative touches were his mother's Bible on a small table and a faded quilt she had made years ago. Mariposa moved through the space with respectful interest, noting the practical layout and the few personal items. She paused at a shelf containing several books, worn volumes on animal husbandry, crop rotation, and basic medicine, along with a surprising collection of poetry. "Wordsworth?" she asked, touching the spine of a particularly well-worn volume. Victor felt heat rise to his face. "My mother's. She used to read them aloud on winter evenings." Mariposa smiled, a genuine warmth that reached her eyes. "My father was fond of poetry as well, said it reminded him that beauty exists even in harsh places." She returned the book to its place. "Your home feels peaceful." It was not the reaction Victor had expected. Most would have seen only the cabin's limitations, its size, its simplicity, the absence of feminine touches. But Mariposa seemed to perceive something deeper, an intentionality in the spareness that reflected his nature. "Would you like something to drink?" he offered, suddenly aware of his responsibilities as host. "I have coffee or water from the well." "Water would be lovely," Mariposa said. "Then perhaps you could show me where you're considering using the spring water." Over the next hour, they walked the northern section of his property, discussing how a limited diversion from the hidden spring might sustain a small area of improved grazing. Mariposa's practical suggestions were interwoven with observations about native plants that could supplement cattle feed during drought periods. "The Apache shown me several varieties that cattle will eat when grass fails," she explained. "Plants that thrive with minimal water but provide decent nutrition." Her knowledge impressed Victor. It was practical frontier wisdom, the kind that came from genuine engagement with the land and its original inhabitants, rather than the rigid application of Eastern farming practices that had failed so many settlers. As the afternoon progressed, clouds began gathering on the western horizon, unusual for the season and promising the possibility of rain. They made their way back to the cabin, continuing their discussion of sustainable ranching practices. "You've given this considerable thought," Victor observed as they reached the porch. Mariposa nodded, her expression growing more serious. "The drought has affected everyone. But I believe those willing to learn from this land, rather than simply imposing their will upon it, have the best chance of thriving here." She glanced at him. "Your willingness to consider alternatives, to respect the spring rather than simply exploiting it, it's unusual among ranchers." "Perhaps I'm simply desperate," Victor said, attempting to lighten the moment. "No," Mariposa countered with quiet certainty. "It's something more fundamental, a recognition that survival here requires adaptation rather than mere persistence." The insight struck uncomfortably close to the evolution in Victor's thinking. Before he could respond, a low rumble of thunder punctuated their conversation, and fat raindrops began to spatter the dusty yard. Seems we're about to get wet, Victor observed, glancing at the darkening sky. The gentle rain quickly intensified, becoming a steady downpour, the first substantial rainfall in months. Rather than seeking immediate shelter, Mariposa stepped off the porch into the open, turning her face upward with an expression of pure joy. "It's magnificent," she laughed, spreading her arms as the rain soaked her dress and plastered golden hair to her head. Exactly what the land has been crying for. Her uninhibited delight was contagious. Victor found himself joining her in the downpour, the cool water washing away weeks of dust and worry. For a moment they stood together in the life-giving rain, sharing a wordless appreciation for the reprieve granted to the thirsty land. When they finally retreated to the porch, both soaked to the skin and laughing, something had shifted between them, a barrier dissolved by shared joy in simple blessing. "You'll catch your death," Victor said, though without real concern. "I have some of my mother's things still. Let me find you something dry." Inside, he located a simple dress in a trunk of his mother's possessions, items he had been unable to part with after her death. Offering Mariposa privacy to change, he stepped onto the covered porch, listening to the rhythmic drumming of rain on the roof. When she emerged, Mariposa wore the simple blue dress that had once belonged to his mother. Though slightly large for her more slender frame, it suited her somehow, the practical frontier garment complementing her natural grace. "Thank you," she said, joining him on the porch. "It's very comfortable." Victor nodded, unexpectedly moved by the sight of his mother's dress given new life. "It suits you." They stood side by side, watching the rain transform the parched landscape. Puddles formed in the yard, reflecting the gray sky. The smell of wet earth rose around them, the scent of renewal, of possibility. "I should start for home before the trails get too muddy," Mariposa said reluctantly, though she made no move to leave. "You're welcome to wait out the worst of it," Victor offered. "I could make some coffee." The invitation hung between them, weighted with unspoken significance. After a moment's consideration, Mariposa nodded. Coffee would be nice. Inside the cabin, Victor busied himself with the stove while Mariposa hung her wet dress near the fire to dry. The domestic scene, a woman in his kitchen, the shared comfort of shelter against the elements, highlighted the starkness of his usual solitude. As he prepared the coffee, Victor found himself sharing stories of his childhood on the ranch, his father's ambitious plans, his mother's gentle influence, the lessons learned from both. Mariposa listened attentively, offering her own memories in return. Her early fascination with plants, her mother's healing work in Pennsylvania, the family's decision to seek a new start in the West after her father's death. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by the comforting sounds of rain and the occasional rumble of distant thunder. It was the most natural interaction Victor had experienced in years, free from the awkward formality that usually characterized his limited social encounters. "Your father believed isolation was necessary for survival," Mariposa observed as they sat at the small table, steaming cups before them. "Yet you've gone against that teaching several times now." Victor considered this. "I'm beginning to think he was shaped by his own hardships, not by universal truth." He traced the rim of his cup thoughtfully. "The frontier changed him, made him harder than he might have been elsewhere." "And you? Has it hardened you the same way?" Her question was gentle but direct. "I thought it had," Victor admitted, "or that it needed to." He met her gaze. "Until recently." The implication hung in the air between them, that she had played a role in this reconsideration of his fundamental beliefs. Mariposa held his gaze steadily, neither pushing for clarification nor retreating from the moment's significance. "I've found," she said finally, "that hardness breaks more easily than flexibility. The Apache taught me that the strongest people bend with adversity rather than standing rigid against it." "Like water finding paths through stone," Victor said, remembering the symbol on the amulet she had given him. Mariposa smiled, pleased by his understanding. "Exactly so." The rain continued as afternoon deepened toward evening, making Mariposa's return journey increasingly impractical. When Victor suggested she stay until morning, offering to sleep in the barn while she took the cabin, she accepted with practical grace rather than conventional protest. "The trails will be treacherous after such a downpour," she agreed. "But I won't displace you from your home. The cabin is large enough for propriety if we're sensible people." Her directness was refreshing in its honesty. which I believe we are. They prepared a simple evening meal together, the domestic collaboration feeling surprisingly natural despite Victor's inexperience with shared tasks. Afterward, they sat before the small fire, the rain's persistent drumming creating a cocoon of intimacy around the cabin. Their conversation drifted from practical matters of ranching to deeper reflections on frontier life, its challenges and unexpected rewards, the ways it stripped away pretense and revealed essential character. I sometimes think the frontier is a mirror, Mariposa observed, gazing into the flames. It reflects back our truest selves, stripped of social niceties and expectations. And what has it shown you about yourself? Victor asked. She considered the question thoughtfully, that I'm stronger than I knew, more adaptable. A small smile played at her lips, and that I value authenticity above most other qualities. Her gaze shifted to him. And you? What has your reflection revealed? Victor had never articulated this, even to himself, that perhaps my father's path wasn't the only way to survive here. That walls built for protection can become a different kind of prison. The honesty of his response hung in the air between them, creating a moment of connection that transcended their brief acquaintance. In Mariposa's violet blue eyes, Victor saw understanding rather than judgment, a recognition of the courage such admission required from a man raised to equate self-sufficiency with worth. As night deepened, they arranged sleeping accommodations with practical efficiency, Mariposa taking the bed while Victor made a comfortable enough pallet near the hearth. The arrangement was unconventional by town standards, but pragmatic in the context of frontier necessity. "Good night, Mr. Macintyre," Mariposa said as she settled beneath his mother's quilt. "Thank you for your hospitality." "Victor," he corrected gently, "I think circumstances warrant first names, don't you?" Her smile was visible even in the dim firelight. "Good night, Victor. I'm glad the rain came today." "As am I, Mariposa." The name felt significant on his tongue, an acknowledgement of shifting boundaries. Sleep came slowly to Victor that night despite physical exhaustion. The presence of Mariposa in his home, her steady breathing from across the room, the subtle scent of herbs that seemed to accompany her, heightened his awareness of how empty the cabin usually felt. The contrast between his habitual solitude and this temporary companionship illuminated the spareness of his existence in ways both uncomfortable and revealing. Yet discomfort brought clarity. As rain continued its gentle percussion on the roof, Victor confronted the possibility that his father's philosophy, the belief that isolation was the price of frontier survival, might be fundamentally flawed. Perhaps true resilience came not from standing alone against adversity, but from building connections strong enough to withstand the frontier's challenges. The realization was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. To reject his father's core teaching was to step into uncharted territory, as uncertain as any physical wilderness. But as sleep finally claimed him, Victor found himself willing, even eager, to explore this new landscape, especially if Mariposa O'Brien might walk some portion of that path beside him. Morning arrived with cleared skies and transformed landscape. The parched earth had absorbed the rain's blessing, already showing hints of green where dormant seeds had waited patiently for moisture. Victor woke at dawn, as was his habit, to find Mariposa already up and moving quietly about the cabin. "Good morning," she greeted him, her hair neatly braided, wearing her now dry dress. "I hope I didn't wake you." "I'm always up at first light," Victor assured her, awkwardly aware of his rumpled appearance. "There's fresh water in the basin if you need it." They shared a simple breakfast of coffee and biscuits left from the previous evening. The easy companionship of the night before continued, though daylight brought a return of certain proprieties that darkness had softened. "I should get back," Mariposa said as they finished. "Thomas and Mother will be worried, especially after the storm." Victor nodded, ignoring the unexpected disappointment her imminent departure created. The trails should be passable now, though muddy in places. As they prepared for her departure, Victor found himself reluctant to return to his solitary routine. Mariposa's presence had brought his home to life in ways he hadn't experienced since his mother's passing, not just through feminine touches, but through engaged conversation and shared perspective. "I've been thinking about your suggestions for the spring water," he said as they walked to where her horse waited. "I'd like to begin implementing them soon, perhaps next week." Would you be willing to advise on the plantings? Mariposa's expression brightened. I'd be happy to help, perhaps Monday if that suits you. Monday would be perfect. Victor hesitated, then added, and perhaps you'd join me for dinner Sunday after church, at Molly's cafe in town. The invitation represented a significant step, not just a practical meeting about ranch improvements, but a public acknowledgement of whatever was developing between them. Mariposa studied him for a moment, seeming to recognize the significance. I'd like that very much, she said simply. Victor helped her mount, their hands touching briefly in the process. Thank you for your company, he said, finding conventional phrases inadequate. It was illuminating. Her smile held understanding of all he wasn't saying. For me as well. Until Sunday, then. As he watched her ride away, Victor felt an unfamiliar lightness in his chest. A sense of anticipation rather than the resignation that had colored his days for so long. The sudden absence of her presence made the ranch seem emptier than before, highlighting how completely she had filled spaces he hadn't known were vacant. Rather than dwelling on this absence, Victor channeled his energy into preparations for implementing their plans for the spring water. The physical labor of clearing the route for a small diversion channel provided welcome distraction, while each decision made with Mariposa's suggestions in mind created a sense of shared purpose even in her physical absence. By Sunday, anticipation had built to an intensity that surprised him. Victor dressed with unusual care for church, ignoring the knowing look Thomas O'Brien gave him when their paths crossed outside the small chapel in Copper Springs. Joining us for services again? Thomas asked, his tone neutral though his eyes held amusement. Seemed like a good day for it, Victor replied with deliberate casualness. Thomas nodded, suppressing a smile. Mari's been experimenting with new herbal preparations all week. Seems inspired somehow. The implication was clear enough to bring heat to Victor's face, but he chose not to respond directly. Your mother's knowledge is impressive. The community is fortunate to have such skilled healers. Indeed we are, Thomas agreed, his expression growing more serious. Though not everyone appreciates their methods, some find Mother's willingness to incorporate Apache remedies concerning. This was news to Victor. Has there been trouble? Nothing direct, whispers mostly, Thomas shrugged. Frontier towns run on gossip, usually harmless. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Alina and Mariposa, the latter wearing a dress of deep blue that complemented her coloring. When she smiled in greeting, Victor momentarily forgot whatever response he had been forming to Thomas's comment. Good morning, Mr. Macintyre, Mariposa said, her formal address belied by the warmth in her eyes. Miss O'Brien, Victor returned, equally formal though similarly betrayed by his expression. Alina and Thomas exchanged glances that neither Victor nor Mariposa noticed, too absorbed in their own carefully restrained interaction. The church service passed in a blur for Victor, his awareness centered on Mariposa's presence several pews ahead. When the congregation dispersed afterward, he made his way to her side, conscious of curious glances from townspeople unaccustomed to seeing the reclusive rancher seeking anyone's company. Shall we? He asked, offering his arm with uncharacteristic formality. Mariposa accepted, her touch light but confident. Mother and Thomas are joining the Andersons for dinner, she explained. They'll meet me later this afternoon. Victor nodded, relieved at the prospect of uninterrupted time together. Molly's cafe occupied a corner of Copper Springs Main Street, offering simple but well-prepared meals that had become the standard for Sunday gatherings. As they entered, conversations momentarily paused, curious gazes following their progress to a table near the window. We seem to be causing a stir, Mariposa observed quietly, amusement rather than discomfort in her tone. Small towns have long memories and limited entertainment, Victor replied dryly. My father's preference for isolation made the Macintyres objects of speculation for years. And now you're breaking pattern, Mariposa noted. That's bound to create interest. Their meal was pleasant despite, or perhaps because of, their awareness of being observed. The necessity of maintaining public propriety added a certain tension to their interaction, an awareness of boundaries that had softened during their rain-sequestered evening at the ranch. As they finished their meal, Molly herself approached their table, a robust woman whose no-nonsense demeanor had made her establishment successful. Good to see you in town, Victor, she said without preamble. Been too long since you took a proper meal. Hello, Molly, Victor greeted her with the ease of long acquaintance. The food was excellent, as always. Molly turned her appraising gaze to Mariposa. Miss O'Brien. Heard about your time with the Apache, brave girl. They treated us with respect, Mrs. Miller, Mariposa replied evenly. We were never in serious danger. Molly's expression suggested skepticism. Well, good to see young folks enjoying civilized company, regardless. The emphasis she placed on civilized did not escape either of them. After Molly departed, Mariposa's expression held a mixture of resignation and amusement. That seems to be a common reaction. People want tales of savagery, not accounts of cultural exchange. The frontier draws firm lines, Victor observed. Makes people uncomfortable when those lines blur. Yes, Mariposa agreed. Though the most valuable knowledge often exists in those blurred spaces. She met his gaze directly. Like understanding that water doesn't recognize human boundaries. The conversation shifted to their plans for the spring water, both more comfortable with practical discussion than navigating the undercurrents of public perception. By the time they left the cafe, they had refined their strategy for the modest diversion project, planning to begin work the following day. Outside, the afternoon had turned pleasantly warm, the recent rain having tempered the summer heat. They walked slowly toward the general store where they had arranged to meet Alina and Thomas later. I've been meaning to ask, Victor said as they strolled. Thomas mentioned some concerns about your mother's use of Apache remedies. Has there been actual trouble? Mariposa's expression sobered. Nothing serious. Some patients are uncomfortable with treatments they don't understand. Mother is careful to explain everything thoroughly, but fear and suspicion run deep. She glanced at him. Our time with the tribe has only heightened these concerns for some people. I'm sorry to hear that, Victor said. Your mother's skills are invaluable here. Most recognize that, Mariposa assured him. It's only a few who see threats in any departure from their understanding of civilized medicine. Her tone held more sadness than anger. The irony is that many conventional remedies are far more dangerous than the gentle herbs mother prefers. They paused outside the general store, reluctant for their time together to end despite the planned continuation the following day. Thank you for dinner, Mariposa said. It was lovely, curious onlookers notwithstanding. Thank you for accepting, Victor replied, despite the attention it seems to have generated. Something shifted in Mariposa's expression, a subtle determination replacing her usual measured composure. Does it bother you, the attention? It was a loaded question, one that probed at implications beyond this single meal. Victor considered it honestly before answering. No, he said finally, though it's unfamiliar. Mariposa nodded, apparently satisfied with his response. Until tomorrow, then. As Victor rode home that afternoon, he found himself contemplating the subtle shift their public appearance together represented. In a small frontier community, such things carried weight, creating expectations, inviting speculation, suggesting intentions he had not fully articulated even to himself. Yet rather than feeling trapped by these social mechanics, Victor experienced an unexpected sense of liberation. The very public nature of their dinner had forced an acknowledgement of what had been developing between them, an attraction and connection that transcended mere practical collaboration. His father would have viewed this as dangerous vulnerability, an unnecessary complication in the already challenging business of frontier survival. But Victor was increasingly certain that his father's philosophy had been fundamentally flawed, that true resilience came not from isolation, but from meaningful connection. As the Crooked M came into view, Victor found himself seeing his ranch with fresh eyes, not just as a struggling inheritance to be preserved, but as a potential home that might someday be shared. The idea, once unthinkable, now filled him with cautious hope rather than alarm. The beaded amulet Mariposa had given him caught the late afternoon light as it hung beside his bed. Like water finding paths through stone, new possibilities were reshaping his understanding of what the frontier demanded, not just endurance, but the courage to build something worth enduring for. The following weeks established a new rhythm to Victor's life, one centered around regular collaboration with Mariposa on the spring water project, interwoven with shared meals, church attendance, and gradually deepening connection. The modest diversion channel they constructed brought life-giving water to a small section of his grazing land, while Mariposa established a medicinal garden near the main spring, cultivating plants that thrived in the microclimate created by the reliable moisture. Their practical partnership provided structure and purpose for their increasing time together, allowing their personal relationship to develop naturally alongside their shared work. With each visit, each conversation, each problem solved together, the walls Victor had built around himself eroded further, revealing a man capable of far deeper connection than he had believed possible. October brought the first hints of autumn to Sagebrush Valley: cooler nights, subtle color changes in the native vegetation, shifts in the quality of light that transformed the landscape. The drought had eased somewhat following several substantial rainstorms, though careful water management remained essential for survival. On a particularly pleasant afternoon, Victor and Mariposa sat together near the medicinal garden, taking a well-deserved rest after hours of work. The garden had flourished under her care, becoming a showcase for her botanical knowledge and practical skills. "The yarrow is doing exceptionally well," she observed, pride evident in her voice. "Mother says it's the finest she's seen since Pennsylvania." Victor nodded, admiring not just the thriving plants, but the woman who had created such abundance from challenging circumstances. Over the past weeks, his appreciation for Mariposa's qualities had deepened from initial attraction to profound admiration for her intelligence, her resilience, her unique blend of practicality and vision. "You've created something remarkable here," he said, "something that will benefit more than just our two families." Mariposa smiled, pleased by his understanding. From the beginning, she had envisioned the garden as a community resource, a place where healing plants could be grown and harvested for whoever needed them. "That was always the intention," she agreed. "Mother believes knowledge and resources should be shared, not hoarded." "A philosophy at odds with frontier thinking," Victor observed. "Perhaps," Mariposa acknowledged. "But I think it's precisely what the frontier needs. People who understand that long-term survival depends on cooperation, not just individual strength." It was a perspective that had fundamentally altered Victor's understanding of frontier life, a gentle but persistent challenge to his father's teachings that had gradually reshaped his worldview. Where once he had seen only harsh competition for scarce resources, Mariposa had helped him recognize possibilities for mutual support and shared knowledge. "Your mother is hosting a harvest gathering next week," Victor said, changing the subject slightly. "Thomas mentioned it yesterday." Mariposa nodded, "A tradition from Pennsylvania. Celebrating autumn bounty, preserving for winter, sharing with neighbors." She glanced at him. "You'll come, I hope." "I'd be honored," Victor replied, though the prospect of a social gathering still created some apprehension. His increasing comfort with the O'Briens hadn't entirely overcome years of habitual isolation. Mariposa seemed to sense his hesitation. "It's quite informal, just a few neighboring families, sharing food and company before winter sets in." Her expression grew more serious. "Winter can be isolating here. Mother believes it's important to strengthen community bonds before the difficult months." Victor understood the wisdom in this. His own winters had been exercises in endurance, long, lonely stretches where days might pass without human contact beyond his own reflection. The prospect of a different experience was both appealing and unsettling. "I'll bring something," he offered, "though my cooking skills are limited." Mariposa laughed, the sound brightening the afternoon. "Perhaps stick to what you know, some beef perhaps." The teasing lightened the moment, easing Victor's uncertainty about the social obligation. This had become a pattern between them, Mariposa gently drawing him toward greater community engagement while respecting his need for gradual transition. As they prepared to head back to their respective homes later that afternoon, Victor found himself reluctant for their time together to end. These hours spent working alongside Mariposa had become the highlight of his weeks, moments of shared purpose interspersed with conversations that ranged from practical ranching matters to deeper explorations of their differing perspectives on frontier life. "I've been thinking," he said as they mounted their horses, "about expanding the water project next spring, perhaps creating a second garden area closer to the ranch house." Mariposa's expression brightened with interest. For vegetables or more medicinal plants. Both maybe with your guidance. Victor hesitated, then added, I've realized how narrow my thinking has been, focusing solely on cattle rather than diversifying what the land produces. That's an insightful observation, Mariposa said, genuine approval in her tone. The most resilient approach combines multiple strategies rather than relying on a single resource. The conversation continued as they rode toward the junction where their paths would separate, each contributing ideas for future collaboration. When they reached the dividing point, Victor found himself extending an invitation that had been forming in his mind for days. Would you consider riding to Copper Springs with me on Saturday? There's a traveling photography studio in town for a few days. He felt uncharacteristically nervous, like a schoolboy rather than a grown rancher. I thought perhaps we might have a portrait made together. The invitation held significance beyond its surface request. In frontier communities, a formal portrait of a couple indicated serious intentions, a documentation of relationship that carried social weight. Mariposa's violet blue eyes widened slightly, recognizing the implication. A soft flush colored her cheeks as she considered his request. I would like that very much, she said finally, her direct gaze conveying understanding of all he wasn't explicitly stating. Saturday morning, then, Victor confirmed, relief and anticipation mingling in his chest. Mariposa nodded. I'll be ready. They parted with the comfortable familiarity that had developed between them, yet Victor felt a new undercurrent of significance in their farewell. The portrait invitation represented a deliberate step toward publicly acknowledging what had been developing privately, a relationship that had grown from unexpected rescue to genuine partnership and deepening affection. The ride home passed in contemplation of this evolution. Victor found himself marveling at how thoroughly his understanding of frontier survival had transformed in the months since that fateful encounter with the Apache. Where once he had believed isolation was necessary for endurance, he now recognized that meaningful connection provided strength beyond anything solitary existence could offer. Mariposa O'Brien had become essential to his life in ways he couldn't have imagined, not just as a potential romantic partner, but as a collaborator whose perspective complemented and expanded his own. Her practical knowledge of plants balanced his understanding of livestock. Her optimistic vision tempered his cautious pragmatism. Her openness to different cultural approaches challenged his inherited assumptions. Together, they were creating something neither could have accomplished alone, a model of frontier adaptation that drew from multiple traditions rather than rigidly adhering to familiar patterns. It was innovation born of necessity but sustained by shared vision. As the Crooked M came into view, Victor realized that for the first time since inheriting the ranch, he was thinking not just of maintaining his father's legacy, but of building something new, something that reflected his own evolving understanding of what mattered on the frontier. The possibility filled him with anticipation rather than anxiety, with hope rather than resignation. And central to this emerging future was the golden-haired woman with remarkable violet blue eyes who had entered his life through the most unlikely circumstances, an offering of water to enemies that had somehow opened a channel for love to flow into his carefully guarded heart. Saturday morning dawned clear and cool, with the crisp quality of light that characterized autumn in the territory. Victor rose earlier than usual, taking unprecedented care with his appearance, trimming his beard to neat precision, donning his seldom-worn suit, polishing his best boots to a respectable shine. The preparations felt significant, an acknowledgement that this day represented more than just a photographic record. The portrait would formalize something that had been developing between him and Mariposa, creating tangible evidence of their connection for both themselves and the community. As he rode toward the O'Brien homestead, Victor found himself uncharacteristically nervous. Though their growing attachment had become increasingly evident to those who knew them, today's outing would make their relationship unmistakably public. In a frontier community where social boundaries were carefully maintained despite harsh conditions, such declarations carried weight. Mariposa was waiting on the porch when he arrived, wearing a dress of deep blue that complemented her coloring and emphasized the remarkable violet blue of her eyes. Her golden hair was arranged in an elegant style that softened her features while maintaining the natural grace that characterized her appearance. "Good morning," she greeted him, a hint of shyness in her smile that suggested she too felt the day's significance. "You look beautiful," Victor said simply, offering his hand to help her into the buggy he had borrowed for the occasion. The ride to Copper Springs was filled with comfortable conversation, though underlying currents of anticipation created a pleasant tension between them. They discussed the harvest gathering Alina was planning, the progress of the medicinal garden, the latest news from town, ordinary topics that provided structure for the extraordinary step they were taking together. Copper Springs showed signs of preparation for winter, stacked firewood behind buildings, merchants receiving final shipments before mountain passes became treacherous, residents completing exterior repairs while weather permitted. The traveling photography studio had set up in a vacant storefront, its presence announced by an elaborate sign promising permanent memories captured with modern artistry. As they entered the makeshift studio, Victor was conscious of curious glances from townspeople who noted their arrival together. By evening, word of their portrait sitting would spread throughout the community, creating expectations neither had verbalized to the other. The photographer, a florid man named Hargrove with an Eastern accent and elaborate waistcoat, greeted them with professional enthusiasm. "A handsome couple," he declared, assessing them with an artist's eye. "The contrast between you is most appealing, fair and dark, delicate and robust. Yes, this will compose beautifully." His matter-of-fact categorization of them as a couple went unchallenged by either Victor or Mariposa, a silent acceptance that confirmed the day's underlying purpose. The sitting itself was an exercise in patience, positions arranged and rearranged, expressions guided, stillness maintained through long exposures. Throughout the process, Victor remained acutely aware of Mariposa beside him, her shoulder occasionally brushing his, her presence both comforting and exhilarating. "Now, sir, if you would place your hand just so," Hargrove directed, indicating a position that would require Victor to rest his hand lightly over Mariposa's. "The suggestion of protective affection, you understand." "Very appropriate." The carefully choreographed touch created a current between them that had nothing to do with the photographer's artistic intentions. When Mariposa's fingers subtly adjusted to interlace with his, Victor felt the gesture like a declaration, quiet but unmistakable in its meaning. "Perfect," Hargrove approved, oblivious to the genuine emotion he had inadvertently captured. "Hold that position, if you please." When the sitting concluded, the photographer promised the finished portrait would be ready before his departure from town the following week. "A fine remembrance," he assured them, "one you'll treasure for years to come." The statement carried implications neither Victor nor Mariposa was prepared to directly address, though the possibility of shared years hung between them like an unspoken hope. Rather than returning immediately to the O'Brien homestead, they decided to take lunch at Molly's Cafe, another public declaration of their developing relationship. The curious glances that had followed their previous meal together were replaced by knowing smiles and approving nods, the community having observed their growing attachment over recent weeks. "It seems our association has been noted," Mariposa observed with amusement as they settled at a table near the window. "Small towns run on observation and speculation," Victor replied dryly. "We've provided ample material for both." Their meal was pleasant, the conversation flowing easily between topics both practical and personal. As they prepared to depart, Molly approached their table with uncharacteristic warmth. "Heard you visited Hargrove's studio this morning," she said without preamble. "About time this town saw some good news, been too much hardship lately." Her forthright approval reflected the community's general response to their developing relationship, a welcome positive development amid the ongoing challenges of frontier life. Outside the cafe, they encountered Sheriff Dawson, whose shrewd gaze assessed them with undisguised interest. "Macintyre," he greeted Victor. "Miss O'Brien, fine day for a portrait, I hear." "News travels quickly," Victor observed, not bothering to question how the sheriff had learned of their morning activities. "Town this size, breathing is noteworthy," Dawson replied with a chuckle. His expression grew more serious as he added, "Good to see life continuing despite difficulties. Reminds folks that hardship isn't the only story being written here." The observation carried more weight than casual conversation warranted, suggesting the sheriff recognized the symbolic importance of new connections forming amid frontier challenges. As they prepared to return to the O'Brien homestead, Victor made a spontaneous decision. "Would you mind if we made a short detour? there's something I'd like to show you." Mariposa agreed readily, curious about his unexpected request. Victor directed the buggy north of town, following a trail that led to a modest rise overlooking the valley. From this vantage point, both their properties were visible: the O'Brien homestead to the north, the Crooked M to the south, the Hidden Springs location marked by subtle vegetation changes between them. "My father brought me here when I was 12, Victor explained as they gazed across the landscape. "Said a man needs to see his place from a distance sometimes, to remember what he's working for." Mariposa nodded, understanding the significance of his sharing this personal memory. "It's beautiful from up here. You can see how the land flows together, not just the artificial boundaries we've created." "That's what I wanted you to see," Victor said, pleased by her intuitive grasp of his intention. "From here, the connection between our properties is obvious, the natural continuation of landscape that links the Crooked M to the O'Brien place." The observation carried implications beyond geography, suggesting a natural extension of their individual lives into something shared and continuous. Mariposa turned to face him fully, her expression open and direct. "Victor," she said softly, "I think we should acknowledge what today means, what we're indicating to ourselves and others by having this portrait made." Her straightforwardness was characteristic, the same clear-eyed approach she brought to all aspects of life. It was a quality Victor had come to deeply appreciate, especially in matters where others might rely on ambiguity or convention. "You're right," he agreed, gathering his courage. "We've been building something together these past months, not just the water project or the garden, but something between us. Something I never expected to find here." "Nor I," Mariposa admitted. "I came west believing independence was the frontier's primary lesson, that I would need to be entirely self-sufficient to survive here." "As did I," Victor said. "My father's teachings emphasized isolation as the only safe approach to frontier life." "Yet here we are," Mariposa observed with a small smile, discovering that perhaps connection rather than separation offers the greater strength. Victor nodded, finding in her words the perfect articulation of his own evolving understanding. "Exactly so. Together we've accomplished what neither could have managed alone, not just practical achievements, but a way of seeing the frontier as something to be understood rather than simply endured." The conversation was leading toward a declaration, both knew it, yet neither rushed the moment. Their relationship had developed through careful consideration and genuine discovery of each other's qualities, not impulsive emotion. "Mariposa," Victor said finally, taking her hands in his. "I'm not a man given to elaborate speeches or poetic declarations, but I want you to know that you have transformed my understanding of what's possible on the frontier, not just for the land, but for the heart." The words were simple but sincere, reflecting the straightforward honesty that characterized their relationship. "I've come to care for you deeply," he continued, "in ways I never believed possible for myself, and if you're willing, I'd like to court you properly, with intention toward a future together." Mariposa's violet-blue eyes held steady on his, her expression revealing that his declaration matched her own feelings. "I would like that very much," she said simply. "I've found in you a partner I never expected, someone who values both practical capability and deeper understanding, who sees the frontier as I do. Challenging but full of possibility." Her hands tightened on his. "Yes, Victor Macintyre, I accept your intention to court me and all that it might lead to." The formal phrasing held the weight of genuine commitment, not a flighty romantic notion, but a considered step toward shared future. It reflected the frontier's influence on their perspective, where decisions carried immediate consequences and relationships required solid foundations to withstand harsh conditions. What followed was not the passionate embrace romance tales might have prescribed, but something equally meaningful, a moment of quiet acknowledgement between two people who had found in each other an unexpected answer to frontier isolation. Victor lifted her hand to his lips in a gesture that combined respect with affection. "Thank you," he said simply. The ride back to the O'Brien homestead was filled with a comfortable awareness of the threshold they had crossed, from unacknowledged attraction to declared intention. Their conversation turned naturally to practical considerations of how their courtship would progress. both being pragmatic enough to recognize that frontier realities required planning alongside sentiment. "Mother and Thomas will be pleased," Mariposa noted. "They've suspected my feelings for some time." "Have I been that transparent?" Victor asked, somewhat chagrined by the thought. Mariposa laughed, the sound brightening the afternoon. "We both have, apparently. Thomas has been alternately amused and impatient, waiting for us to acknowledge the obvious." At the O'Brien homestead, Elinor greeted them with a knowing smile that confirmed Mariposa's assessment. When Victor formally requested permission to court her daughter, a courtesy he felt appropriate despite Mariposa's obvious independence, Elinor's approval was warm and immediate. "You've proven your character through actions, Mr. Macintyre," she said. "From that first offering of water to enemies, through all your subsequent support, I can think of no man better suited to partner with my daughter in frontier life." Thomas, returning from chores to find Victor engaged in formal conversation with his mother, assessed the situation with a glance and offered his own straightforward endorsement. "About time," he said simply, clapping Victor on the shoulder. "Welcome to the family, or at least the beginning of that journey." Their easy acceptance reinforced what Victor had come to value about the O'Briens: their practical approach to life's challenges and opportunities, their ability to recognize genuine quality beneath surface considerations. As he prepared to depart, promising to return the following day for the harvest gathering, Victor experienced a profound sense of rightness, as if pieces long scattered had finally found their proper arrangement. The prospect of courting Mariposa formally, with the community's knowledge and her family's blessing, filled him with anticipation rather than anxiety. The ride back to the Crooked M allowed time for reflection on the day's significance. In initiating courtship with Mariposa O'Brien, Victor had taken a definitive step away from his father's philosophy of isolation. Yet rather than feeling he had betrayed his upbringing, he sensed he had discovered its incompleteness, recognized that survival without connection was mere existence, not living. The ranch buildings came into view as evening approached, the familiar structures suddenly appearing different to his perspective. Where once he had seen only responsibility and burden, he now recognized potential and possibility, a place that might someday be shared rather than simply endured alone. As Victor unsaddled his horse and completed evening chores, his thoughts continued to circle back to Mariposa. Her intelligence and practicality, her unique blend of strength and gentleness, her ability to see opportunity where others perceived only hardship. In her, he had found not just a potential wife, but a genuine partner for frontier life, someone whose capabilities complemented his own, whose vision expanded rather than simply mirrored his understanding. That night, Victor removed the beaded amulet Mariposa had given him months earlier, studying the water pattern worked into its surface. The Apache symbol had proven prophetic. Like water finding paths through stone, love had carved channels through his carefully constructed isolation, creating space for connection where none had seemed possible. As he drifted toward sleep, Victor found himself contemplating the future with unprecedented hope. The frontier remained challenging. The coming winter would bring hardships, as all winters did, but the prospect of facing these difficulties with Mariposa beside him transformed his perspective entirely. For the first time since inheriting the ranch, Victor Macintyre fell asleep thinking not merely of survival, but of building a life worth the struggle it required. A life enriched by shared purpose and genuine affection that made the frontier's harshness bearable through its promise of rewards beyond mere endurance. Elinor O'Brien's harvest gathering brought together neighboring families from across Sagebrush Valley, ranchers, farmers, and townspeople united by the shared experience of frontier life. The O'Brien homestead buzzed with activity as guests arrived bearing dishes that represented their diverse backgrounds: German sauerkraut alongside Mexican chili, Irish stew beside Apache-inspired corn preparations, creating a tangible representation of the cultural blending that characterized frontier communities despite persistent tensions. Victor arrived early to help with preparations, his newly declared courtship of Mariposa creating a different dynamic to his interaction with the O'Brien family. Thomas treated him with the easy familiarity of a prospective brother, while Elinor included him in family conversations as if his eventual integration was assured rather than merely possible. Mariposa greeted him with undisguised pleasure, her golden hair arranged simply but elegantly, her dress a russet color that complemented the autumn surroundings. "You came," she said, the simple observation carrying layers of meaning. Acknowledgement of his historical reluctance regarding social gatherings, appreciation for his willingness to change for her sake. "I promised I would," Victor replied, the echo of earlier commitments between them intentional. As guests arrived throughout the afternoon, Victor found himself introduced repeatedly as Mariposa's gentleman caller, a designation that created knowing smiles among the older generation and curious assessment from younger community members. The public acknowledgement of their courtship generated congratulations and good-natured teasing, particularly from those who had observed their growing attachment over recent months. "About time you found yourself a partner, Macintyre," declared Henry Jensen, a neighboring rancher whose weather-beaten face reflected decades of frontier life. "Man wasn't meant to face this country alone. Your father never did understand that." The observation stung slightly, touching as it did on Victor's complicated relationship with his father's teachings. Yet he recognized the truth in Jensen's words. His father's insistence on self-reliance had ultimately created unnecessary hardship, limiting rather than enhancing his ability to thrive on the frontier. "I'm learning there are many approaches to frontier living," Victor acknowledged, "some more sustainable than others." Jensen nodded approvingly. "That's wisdom talking. Took me 20 years to figure that out." He glanced toward Mariposa, who was engaged in conversation with several women near the food tables. "Miss O'Brien's got a good head on her shoulders. Smart match, if you don't mind my saying so." Throughout the gathering, Victor observed how naturally Mariposa moved between different groups, discussing cattle breeding with ranchers, herbal remedies with townswomen, crop rotation with farmers. Her genuine interest in diverse knowledge and her ability to connect seemingly unrelated approaches into cohesive strategies mirrored the very integration their relationship represented. Frontier pragmatism, enhanced rather than diminished by openness to multiple perspectives. As afternoon deepened toward evening, the gathering transitioned from meal to celebration. Musical instruments appeared, a fiddle, a guitar, a mouth harp, creating impromptu entertainment that soon had couples dancing in the cleared area before the cabin. The music blended traditional tunes from various cultures, another representation of the frontier's capacity to forge new patterns from diverse traditions. "Would you care to dance?" Victor asked Mariposa during a momentary lull between conversations. Her expression brightened with pleasure. "I didn't know you danced." "I don't particularly," Victor admitted, "but I'm willing to learn." The admission reflected a broader truth about their relationship, his increasing openness to experiences outside his comfort zone, inspired by her example and encouraged by her appreciation. They joined other couples as the musicians began a simple waltz. Victor's movements were initially stiff, his concentration evident as he worked to follow the rhythm, but Mariposa's natural grace compensated for his lack of practice. Gradually, he relaxed into the experience, finding unexpected pleasure in their synchronized movement. "You're doing wonderfully," Mariposa encouraged, her violet blue eyes warm with approval. "I have an excellent partner," Victor replied, the statement extending beyond their dance to encompass all they were building together. As darkness fell, lanterns were lit, creating pools of golden light throughout the gathering. Children played games at the periphery, while adults continued conversations beside the bonfire Thomas had constructed. The atmosphere was one of community solidarity against the coming winter, shared resources, exchanged knowledge, mutual support in preparation for the frontier's harshest season. Eleanor O'Brien moved among her guests with natural hospitality, ensuring everyone's comfort while facilitating connections between neighbors who might benefit from each other's experience. Victor observed how her healing work had positioned her as a community linchpin, trusted by diverse residents, her home a natural gathering point for shared celebration. "Your mother has created something remarkable here," he commented to Mariposa as they took a moment apart from the main gathering. "A true community center." Mariposa nodded, pride evident in her expression. "It's what she hoped for when we came west, not just a new start for our family, but a chance to build connections that transcend the usual frontier divisions." "She succeeded admirably," Victor observed. "I've never seen such diverse neighbors so comfortable together." "It takes intentional effort," Mariposa said. Frontier communities naturally fragment without someone working to maintain connections across differences. The insight resonated with Victor's evolving understanding of frontier dynamics. His father had viewed social divisions as inevitable and separation as prudent, but the O'Briens demonstrated an alternative approach, one that recognized the practical value of community cohesion despite cultural differences. As the evening progressed, several guests approached them with congratulations on their courtship, often accompanied by good-natured advice for frontier partnerships. "Secret to lasting out here is flexibility," counseled Martha Wilson, whose 30-year marriage to the town blacksmith represented one of the community's most enduring unions. "Rigid ideas break under pressure. Learn to bend together when storms come, and you'll still be standing when they pass." The wisdom echoed the water symbolism of Mariposa's gifted amulet, persistence through adaptation rather than unyielding resistance. It confirmed Victor's growing conviction that his father's approach to frontier life had been fundamentally flawed in its emphasis on isolation and inflexible self-reliance. Near the gathering's conclusion, Sheriff Dawson arrived, his late appearance suggesting official business rather than social participation. He spoke briefly with a leaner before approaching Victor and Mariposa, where they sat near the bonfire. "Evening, Macintyre, Miss O'Brien." His greeting was cordial, though his expression held concern. "Sorry to intrude on the festivities." "Is something wrong, Sheriff?" Mariposa asked, noting his serious demeanor. Dawson hesitated, clearly uncomfortable disrupting the celebration. "Nothing immediate, just wanted to give folks a heads up. Had word from up north that Two Feathers Band has left the reservation." The news created an immediate shift in atmosphere. Two Feathers was known as one of the more militant Apache leaders, resistant to reservation confinement and vocal about settlers' encroachment on traditional territories. "Any indication of their intentions?" Victor asked, automatically calculating distances and vulnerabilities. "Nothing specific," Dawson replied. "Could be just hunting, could be more. Armies tracking them, but thought people should know to keep alert, especially isolated homesteads." The warning cast a shadow over the gathering's conclusion, reminding everyone of the frontier's persistent tensions despite the evening's demonstration of community cohesion. As guests departed, conversations turned toward practical preparations, checking ammunition supplies, planning neighbor checks, considering defensive arrangements. Victor found himself automatically included in these discussions, his courtship of Mariposa integrating him into community planning in ways his previous isolation had prevented. Ranchers who had barely acknowledged him in town now sought his input on coordinated responses, recognizing that protection of scattered homesteads required mutual support rather than individual vigilance. As the last guests departed, Victor lingered to help the O'Briens restore order to their homestead. The physical labor of moving tables and banking fires provided structure for processing the evening's contrasting elements, the warm celebration of community connection disrupted by reminder of underlying frontier tensions. "Don't let Dawson's news overshadow what was accomplished tonight," Alina advised, noting their sobered mood. "Community bonds strengthen precisely because we face challenges together, not despite them." Her perspective offered important reframing, recognizing threat while refusing to allow it to undermine the evening's positive achievements. It was another example of the balanced approach to frontier life that Victor had come to value in the O'Brien family. Neither naive optimism nor paralyzing vigilance, but practical realism infused with determined hope. When preparations for his departure were complete, Mariposa walked with Victor to where his horse waited. The night had turned cool, stars sharp and brilliant above them. "I'll ride over tomorrow," Victor said. "Make sure your defenses are adequate just in case." Mariposa nodded, accepting his concern without protest. "Thomas has already mentioned checking the rifle supplies. We're not unduly alarmed, but preparedness matters." Her balanced response reflected their shared approach to frontier challenges. Practical precautions without panic, reasonable concerns without overreaction. "Today was important," Mariposa continued, changing the subject deliberately. "Seeing you become part of the community gathering, contributing to shared preparations." Victor understood her meaning. "It felt different than I expected. Less awkward, more necessary somehow." "That's the truth my father never understood about the frontier," Mariposa observed. Individual strength matters, but community resilience matters more. We survive together or not at all. The insight crystallized Victor's evolving perspective on frontier life, not rejecting his father's emphasis on self-reliance, but recognizing its incompleteness when not balanced by community connection. "You've changed how I see everything," he admitted. "Not just our relationship, but my understanding of what the frontier actually requires." Mariposa's expression softened in the starlight. "We've changed each other, I think. Your practical approach balances my theoretical knowledge. Together, we see more clearly than either could alone." The observation captured the essence of their partnership, complementary strengths creating deeper understanding than individual perspective could achieve. It was frontier adaptation at its most fundamental level, drawing from diverse approaches to create solutions uniquely suited to present challenges. Their farewell held the comfortable affection of established attachment rather than the uncertain excitement of new connection. Victor's promise to return the following day was practical commitment rather than romantic gesture, reflecting their relationship's foundation in shared purpose alongside deepening emotion. As he rode toward home through the starlit night, Victor found himself contemplating the evening's contrasting elements. Community celebration shadowed by potential threat, personal joy tempered by practical concern. Rather than seeing these as contradictions, he recognized them as the frontier's fundamental nature, opportunity and danger intertwined, requiring balanced response rather than singular focus. The Crooked M appeared different as he approached, no longer just isolated inheritance but potential contribution to community resilience. His developing relationship with Mariposa had changed not just his personal prospects, but his understanding of the ranch's purpose within the larger settlement pattern. That night, completing final chores with heightened awareness of potential threat, Victor found himself grateful for the community connections the harvest gathering had strengthened. His father had viewed neighbors with suspicion, as potential competitors for scarce resources. Now Victor recognized them as essential allies in frontier survival, not just for physical protection, but for the knowledge exchange and shared burden that made harsh conditions bearable. The beaded amulet caught moonlight filtering through the cabin window as Victor prepared for sleep. Its water symbolism seemed increasingly prophetic, representing not just his developing relationship with Mariposa, but his evolving understanding of frontier requirements. Like water adapting to landscape rather than fighting against it, successful settlement required flexibility and connection rather than rigid isolation. As sleep approached, Victor's thoughts returned to Mariposa, her insight and adaptability, her balanced approach to frontier challenges, her capacity to maintain hope without surrendering practicality. In her, he had found not just personal connection but a partner whose perspective complemented and expanded his own, creating possibility where he had previously seen only endurance. The frontier remained dangerous. Two feathers band a reminder of persistent tensions beneath temporary peace. Yet Victor faced these realities with fundamentally altered perspective, not as isolated challenges to be confronted alone, but as shared concerns to be addressed through community resilience and partnered strength. It was, he realized, the most significant transformation Mariposa had inspired, not just opening his heart to personal connection, but expanding his understanding of frontier survival beyond his father's limited vision. In doing so, she had given him something beyond mere companionship, a more complete truth about what building a life in this harsh land actually required. The following weeks brought increased vigilance throughout Sagebrush Valley, as rumors of Two Feathers' movements circulated among scattered homesteads. Though no direct encounters had occurred, cattle gone missing from northern ranges and reports of observed campfires in prohibited areas maintained a constant undercurrent of tension within the community. Victor divided his time between necessary ranch work and frequent visits to the O'Brien homestead, his officially acknowledged courtship of Mariposa providing legitimate reason for regular presence without raising eyebrows. Thomas welcomed his practical assistance with defensive preparations, while Alina appreciated the additional security his visits provided. Mariposa herself maintained remarkable equilibrium despite the increased tensions, continuing her work with the medicinal garden, accompanying her mother on healing visits to neighboring homesteads and developing plans for winter preparations. Her refusal to allow threat to dominate daily life impressed Victor, who recognized in her approach a resilience born of practical optimism rather than naive dismissal of danger. "We can acknowledge risk without surrendering to fear," she explained when he commented on her composure. "The moment we allow potential threat to control our actions, we've already lost something essential." It was perspective Victor found increasingly valuable, not just regarding Apache tensions, but in approaching frontier life generally. The balance she maintained between preparation and paralysis, between vigilance and terror, represented frontier wisdom his father's teachings had never encompassed. Their courtship progressed with the steady deliberation that characterized their personalities. Daily interactions revealed complementary approaches to challenges, Victor's practical problem-solving enhancing Mariposa's innovative thinking, her conceptual connections providing context for his tactical solutions. Together, they addressed homestead concerns with collaborative efficiency that demonstrated their natural partnership beyond romantic attachment. On a crisp November morning, Victor rode to Copper Springs to collect the portrait Hargrove had completed before departing the territory. The photographer had left the finished image with Molly for safekeeping, entrusting delivery to her renowned reliability. "Been holding this for you," Molly said, producing a carefully wrapped package from beneath her counter. "Hargrove said it's one of his finest works." Victor thanked her, tucking the unopened portrait into his saddlebag despite Molly's obvious curiosity about its appearance. He preferred to view it first with Mariposa, maintaining the private significance of what had become a public declaration of their relationship. At the O'Brien homestead, he found Mariposa alone, Eleanor and Thomas having departed earlier for a healing visit to a distant ranch. Their absence created rare privacy for viewing the portrait together, without family observation of their reaction. "I've been curious about how it turned out," Mariposa admitted as they unwrapped the package at the kitchen table. Hargrove seemed quite invested in the artistic quality. The portrait revealed itself gradually as Victor removed the protective covering. Hargrove had indeed produced a remarkable image, capturing not just their physical appearance but something of the connection between them. Their formal pose demonstrated appropriate propriety, yet the composition suggested partnership rather than mere courting convention. Their shoulders at equal height, their expressions conveying mutual respect alongside affection. Most striking was how the photographer had captured their complementary qualities, Victor's strength balanced by evident gentleness, Mariposa's delicacy undergirded by visible determination. It was a visual representation of their relationship's foundation, equal contribution of different but harmonizing strengths. "It's us," Mariposa said simply, touching the image with gentle fingertips. "Not just our appearances, but something of who we are together." Victor nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Hargrove saw more than I expected. The portrait would require appropriate framing before display, but its completion represented another step in the public formalization of their relationship. By frontier custom, such images occupied prominent positions in family homes, visible declarations of committed attachment. "Where will you display it?" Mariposa asked, the question carrying implications about future arrangements rather than mere decoration. "I thought perhaps above the fireplace," Victor replied, "though that location might change depending on future developments." The careful phrasing acknowledged unspoken possibilities regarding their relationship's progression. Considerations neither was ready to articulate directly, but both recognized as eventual conversation. Their discussion of the portrait's merits was interrupted by the sound of approaching riders, multiple horses arriving at speed rather than the casual pace of expected visitors. Victor moved automatically to the window, instinct triggering vigilance before conscious thought engaged. "Thomas and Mother returning?" Mariposa asked, noting his sudden alertness. "More than 2 riders," Victor replied, scanning the approaching group. Recognition dawned as they drew closer. "It's Sheriff Dawson with deputies." The official party's urgent approach suggested development rather than routine visit. Victor and Mariposa moved to the porch, watching as 4 riders entered the homestead yard, dust rising from their horses' hooves telling story of hard riding. "Macintyre," Dawson acknowledged, dismounting quickly. "Good you're here." "Miss O'Brien, where's your brother and mother?" "At the Peterson Ranch," Mariposa replied, concern evident in her expression. "Mrs. Peterson's time is near." Dawson nodded grimly. When are they expected back? Not until tomorrow, Mariposa said. What's happened, Sheriff? The lawman exchanged glances with his deputies before answering. 2 Feathers Band raided the Northfield place last night. Took livestock, burned outbuildings. The news sent ice through Victor's veins. The Northfield ranch lay less than 20 miles north, close enough to represent immediate rather than theoretical threat. Casualties? He asked, dreading the answer. None, thankfully, Dawson replied. Northfields were in town for supplies, found the damage when they returned this morning. He removed his hat, running a hand through graying hair. Army's been notified, but they're stretched thin with troubles further north. I'm organizing a civilian patrol, making sure isolated homesteads are either defended or evacuated until this is resolved. The implication was clear. With Thomas and Alina absent, the O'Brien place represented vulnerable target unless adequately protected. I'll stay, Victor said immediately, until Thomas returns. Dawson nodded, unsurprised by the offer. Figured you might. We're advising women and children to consider moving to town temporarily, especially from outlying homesteads. Mariposa straightened, her expression determined. I appreciate the concern, Sheriff, but I won't abandon our home. We've worked too hard establishing ourselves here. Victor recognized the impulse. Frontier pride intertwined with practical consideration of what evacuation would mean for livestock, crops, and carefully built homestead. Yet concern for her safety overrode respect for her independence. Mariposa, he began carefully, perhaps the sheriff's suggestion merits consideration. Her violet blue eyes flashed with uncharacteristic sharpness. I'm not helpless, Victor. I can handle a rifle as well as most men, and I know this property's defensive advantages better than anyone except Thomas. The assertion was likely accurate. Frontier necessity had ensured most women possessed basic defensive skills alongside domestic abilities. Yet Victor's protective instinct battled with respect for her capability, creating internal conflict evident in his expression. Sheriff Dawson, recognizing developing disagreement, intervened with practical compromise. Miss O'Brien, your shooting skills aren't in question, but 2 defenders are minimum for adequate coverage of a property this size. He glanced at Victor. Even with Macintyre staying, you'd be undermanned if anything happened before your brother returns. Before Mariposa could object, he continued. What if I leave Deputy Collins here as additional support? 3 defenders makes more sense, especially through the night watches. The suggestion offered reasonable middle ground, acknowledging Mariposa's determination to remain while providing additional security that made her choice less concerning. After brief consideration, Mariposa nodded. That seems sensible, Sheriff, thank you. Relief eased the tension in Victor's shoulders. Though still concerned for her safety, he respected her unwillingness to abandon the homestead her family had worked so hard to establish. The frontier fostered such determination, the understanding that what came hard-earned was not easily surrendered, even temporarily. Practical arrangements followed quickly, Deputy Collins retrieving his gear from saddlebags, Dawson providing latest information about 2 Feathers' suspected locations, communication signals established for emergency notification. Within 30 minutes, the sheriff departed with his remaining deputies, continuing their circuit of isolated homesteads to organize valley-wide defense. The sudden shift from peaceful portrait viewing to defensive preparation created cognitive dissonance that reflected frontier reality, how quickly circumstances could transform from normal routine to survival response. Victor observed how efficiently Mariposa adapted to the changed situation, her movements purposeful rather than panicked as she secured windows, inventoried ammunition, and prepared emergency supplies. Deputy Collins, a stocky man in his 30s with frontier experience evident in his weathered features, assessed the property's defensive positions with professional attention. Good sight lines from the second-floor window, he noted. And that stone outcropping provides natural cover for approaching the barn if needed. Together, they established watch rotation and communication protocols, emergency response plans, and defensive positions. By mid-afternoon, the homestead had transformed from working ranch to miniature fortress, routine activities continuing, but underlying vigilance reshaping every action. As evening approached, Victor found moment alone with Mariposa while Collins checked perimeter fencing. The day's developments had created tension between them, his protective instinct colliding with her independence in ways that required addressing rather than ignoring. "I apologize if I seem to question your capabilities," Victor began, careful to acknowledge the source of her earlier flash of anger. "My concern for your safety overwhelmed better judgment." Mariposa's expression softened. "And I reacted too sharply. I understand your concern." She moved closer, reaching for his hand in rare physical contact. "But you must understand something fundamental about me, Victor. I cannot be the kind of woman who retreats to town at first sign of danger, while men defend what I've helped build. That's not partnership as I understand it." The declaration illuminated her character with crystal clarity. Not mere stubbornness but core identity, fundamental self-understanding that shaped her approach to frontier life. Victor recognized that any future together would require respecting this essential quality rather than attempting to protect her from it. "I understand," he said, meaning it completely. "And I admire that conviction, even while worrying for your safety. It's an uncomfortable balance." "That's frontier life," Mariposa observed with small smile. "Uncomfortable balances between conflicting necessities. We navigate them together, respecting each other's concerns while honoring each other's capabilities." The insight captured their relationship's essence, mutual respect that acknowledged differences without attempting to reshape the other into more comfortable form. It was adaptation rather than domination, the very approach to frontier living they had cultivated through their water project and garden collaboration. Night fell with heightened awareness, ordinary darkness transformed by potential threat into terrain of tactical consideration rather than mere absence of light. Watch rotation began with Collins taking first shift, allowing Victor and Mariposa brief rest before their turns. Unable to sleep despite physical tiredness, Victor found Mariposa similarly wakeful in the kitchen, boiling water for tea with careful attention to preventing light from showing through covered windows. "Tea helps settle nerves," she explained, setting steaming cup before him. "Mother's special blend, chamomile with valerian root and passion flower." Victor accepted the offering gratefully, noticing herbal scent beneath steam. "Your mother's knowledge is remarkable. The community doesn't fully appreciate what they have in her." "Some do," Mariposa acknowledged. "Others find her methods suspicious precisely because they work better than conventional approaches." She sipped her own tea thoughtfully. The frontier creates contradictions, need for new solutions alongside distrust of unfamiliar methods. The observation reflected her consistent insight into frontier dynamics, recognizing underlying patterns beneath surface manifestations. It was perspective Victor had come to value deeply, her ability to perceive connections others missed, context that gave meaning to isolated events. "What will you do when this immediate crisis passes?" she asked after comfortable silence. "Return to normal routine at the Crooked M." The question carried implications beyond immediate planning, touching on their relationship's progression and future arrangements still undefined between them. "That depends on several factors," Victor replied carefully. "The ranch requires attention, certainly, but my priorities have shifted significantly in recent months." Mariposa nodded, understanding his meaning without requiring explicit declaration. Priorities change as circumstances evolve. The frontier teaches adaptability above all else. "Indeed it does," Victor agreed, though some adaptations come more naturally than others. Their conversation paused as Collins entered briefly to report all quiet outside before returning to his watch position. The interruption reset their discussion to more immediate concerns: practical planning for Thomas and Alina's return, consideration of additional defensive measures, rotation of livestock between secure pastures. Yet underlying the tactical conversation, unspoken understanding remained. That crisis had accelerated necessary consideration of their relationship's direction. Frontier courtship typically progressed more quickly than Eastern conventions, practical necessity overriding social tradition when circumstances demanded clarity rather than prolonged uncertainty. As Victor prepared to relieve Collins for second watch, Mariposa touched his arm lightly. "Be careful," she said simply. The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning, acknowledgement of growing attachment that made his safety matter beyond mere practical consideration. It was as close to declaration of deeper feeling as frontier restraint permitted during crisis, expression of emotion through concern rather than romantic language. Always, Victor promised, the response similarly layered with unspoken meaning. The night passed without incident, sunrise bringing reduced tension though not eliminated vigilance. Morning chores proceeded with tactical awareness, livestock checked from defensive positions, water collected with attention to exposure, routine maintenance conducted with weapons close at hand. By mid-morning, dust on the horizon signaled approaching riders, tension rising until Thomas and Alina were recognizable leading their wagon at steady pace. Victor rode out to meet them, providing brief explanation of current situation before they reached the homestead. Thomas absorbed the information with grim attention, while Alina's expression revealed practical calculation rather than fear, assessment of necessary adjustments rather than emotional reaction to potential danger. "Peterson delivery went well?" Victor asked as they continued toward the ranch buildings. "Healthy boy, straightforward birth," Alina confirmed. "Sarah's first, so we stayed longer than strictly necessary." Her attention shifted to immediate concerns. "Has anyone checked the Wilkins place? They're even more isolated than we are." The question demonstrated her characteristic prioritization of community welfare alongside family security, concern extending beyond personal safety to neighbors' well-being. It was quality Victor had come to deeply respect in both O'Brien women, their instinctive inclusion of broader community in their consideration rather than mere focus on individual survival. At the homestead, reunion with Mariposa brought emotional release evident in Alina's embracing her daughter with unusual demonstration of physical affection. Though frontier necessity typically constrained such displays, crisis temporarily suspended normal restraint. Thomas's greeting combined brotherly teasing with genuine relief. "Heard you refused to evacuate," he said, affectionate pride evident beneath surface humor. "Stubborn as always." "Determined," Mariposa corrected with smile. "And well supported." She glanced toward Victor with warmth that communicated appreciation beyond words. Deputy Collins provided formal report of night's uneventful passage before preparing to depart, his presence no longer essential with Thomas's return providing adequate defensive numbers. The O'Briens thanked him sincerely for his service, Alina pressing package of medicinal supplies into his hands as practical expression of gratitude. With immediate crisis management addressed, attention turned to longer-term planning, how daily operations would continue under heightened vigilance, what adjustments would maximize safety without surrendering necessary productivity. The conversation flowed naturally between tactical considerations and practical homesteading, revealing frontier adaptation at its most fundamental level, integration of security concerns with essential living requirements. Victor contributed actively to discussion, his suggestions reflecting deepened understanding of the O'Briens' priorities alongside defensive experience. The collaborative planning demonstrated their natural partnership, his practical approach complementing their innovative thinking, creating comprehensive strategy neither could have developed alone. As afternoon advanced, Victor prepared reluctantly for return to the Crooked M, aware that his own ranch required attention despite preference for remaining at the O'Brien homestead during uncertain times. Thomas's presence provided adequate security, but separation from Mariposa created concern beyond practical consideration, emotional investment making distance uncomfortable in ways he hadn't anticipated. "I'll return tomorrow," he promised as they stood beside his saddled horse. "Sooner if anything develops." Mariposa nodded, understanding necessity while sharing his reluctance for separation. "We'll maintain normal operations with appropriate precautions. Thomas has already reinforced the north fence line." Their farewell held layers of unspoken communication, concern beneath practical planning, affection behind tactical arrangement, deeper attachment informing every word and gesture without direct expression. It reflected their relationship's evolution, communication transcending verbal exchange through developed understanding of each other's thinking. As Victor rode toward home, his thoughts turned to longer-term considerations beyond immediate crisis, how the developing situation might impact their courtship's progression, whether circumstances warranted accelerating decisions typically made over longer periods. Frontier relationships often advanced more quickly than Eastern conventions, practical necessity, creating different timelines when external factors introduced uncertainty into future planning. The Crooked M appeared unchanged upon his return, though Victor approached with heightened vigilance, scanning surroundings for signs of disturbance before dismounting. Finding everything as left, he completed necessary chores with efficient attention, mind divided between immediate tasks and broader considerations. That evening, completing final security checks before retiring, Victor found himself contemplating the empty cabin with new perspective. What once had represented adequate shelter now appeared incomplete, its solitary accommodation emphasizing absence rather than sufficiency. The portrait he and Mariposa had viewed that morning remained carefully wrapped on the table, its presence simultaneously promise and question about future arrangements still undefined between them. As he prepared for sleep, revolver placed within easy reach beside his bed, Victor recognized that crisis had clarified priorities with unexpected clarity. The prospect of frontier violence had stripped away ambiguity about his feelings for Mariposa, revealing depth of attachment that transcended mere courtship convention or practical partnership. The realization demanded action rather than continued deliberation, decision appropriate to frontier directness rather than prolonged Eastern ritual. With this clarity came determination to address their relationship's future directly when crisis permitted, conversation necessary for both practical planning and emotional honesty. Sleep came with resolution formed, that when immediate danger passed, he would speak plainly to Mariposa about joining their lives permanently rather than maintaining separate homesteads with divided attention and unnecessary separation. The frontier's harsh reminder of life's uncertainty had provided corresponding gift of clarity about what truly mattered amid its challenging landscape. The following week brought increased military presence throughout Sagebrush Valley as Army detachments arrived from Fort McAllister to address the Apache situation. Cavalry patrols established regular circuits between isolated homesteads, while scouts tracked Two Feathers Band movements through surrounding mountains. Tension remained high despite additional protection, the community's normal routines altered by defensive necessity. Children kept close to homes, travel conducted in groups rather than individually, nighttime activities curtailed in favor of secured properties before darkness fell. Church attendance increased notably, frontier uncertainty driving some toward spiritual comfort alongside practical precautions. Victor divided his time between necessary ranch work and frequent presence at the O'Brien homestead, his courtship of Mariposa providing legitimate reason for regular visits while allowing additional defensive support for their property. The arrangement satisfied both practical security concerns and emotional desire for continued connection despite regional instability. Their relationship deepened through shared crisis management, finding solace in the quiet moments between patrols, their bond strengthening like iron forged in fire. They learned to communicate without words, a glance across a room sufficient to convey concern, reassurance, or affection. The blow, when it finally fell, came not with the thunder of hooves but with the whisper of wind. It began on a Tuesday afternoon, the sky turning a bruised purple as a winter dust storm rolled down from the mountains. Visibility dropped to mere yards, the howling wind masking all other sounds. Victor was at the O'Brien homestead, helping Thomas reinforce the barn doors against the gale when the horses inside went frantic. "Easy now," Thomas shouted over the wind, trying to calm a rearing mare. Victor froze, his hand going to his colt. Horses didn't spook like that from wind alone. "Thomas, get to the house." Before the words had fully left his lips, a shape materialized out of the swirling brown dust. A rider, painted for war, launching a torch onto the dry thatch of the lean-to. "Apache," Victor yelled, grabbing Thomas by the shoulder and shoving him toward the cabin. They sprinted through the blinding dust, bullets kicking up spurts of earth around their boots. They burst through the front door, Victor slamming the heavy bar into place just as a heavy weight impacted the wood from the outside. "Mariposa, Eleanor, get down," Victor commanded, moving instantly to the window loop. "We're armed," Mariposa's voice came from the stairway. She stood there, a Winchester rifle in her hands, her face pale but set with grim determination. Eleanor was beside her, clutching a shotgun. "Two Feathers," Victor grimaced, peering through the crack in the shutter. "They used the storm for cover. We're cut off." The siege that followed was a brutal test of every defense they had prepared. The attackers were disciplined and patient, firing only when a silhouette appeared, pinning the defenders inside. Victor and Thomas held the ground floor, moving from window to create the illusion of greater numbers. Mariposa took the upper floor, her sharp eyes spotting movement in the dust that the men missed. "They're circling the blind side," she called down, her voice steady despite the chaos. 3 of them moving toward the kitchen wall. Victor shifted his position, firing 2 shots through the kitchen loophole. A cry of pain from outside confirmed his aim. Good eyes, Mariposa. But the wind was their enemy. The dust forced its way through every crack, choking them, grit coating their tongues and stinging their eyes. And then the smell changed. "Smoke," Alina whispered, sniffing the air. "They've torched the brush pile near the north wall," Thomas coughed, wiping soot from his face. "The wind is driving it right at the house." Victor looked at Mariposa. For the first time he saw fear in her violet blue eyes, not for herself but for her family. The cabin was sturdy, but it was wood. If the fire caught the main structure, they would be forced out into the open, where the warriors waited. "We need water," Thomas said, grabbing a bucket. "If we soak the north wall." "The pump is outside," Victor reminded him harshly. "We have the barrel in the kitchen, that's it." They worked frantically, soaking blankets in their precious drinking water and hanging them over the north windows. The heat was rising, the logs beginning to groan under the thermal stress. "It's not enough," Victor realized, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at Mariposa, who was coughing in the thickening smoke. He made a decision. "I'm going out, I'll draw their fire to the barn. You all make a run for the creek bed." "No," Mariposa dropped the wet blanket she was holding and grabbed his arm. "That's suicide, Victor. There are at least a dozen of them." "It's the only chance," he insisted, his hand covering hers on his arm. "I won't let you burn." "There is another way," Mariposa said, her eyes wide with a sudden idea. She moved toward the front door. "What are you doing?" Thomas shouted. "I saw him," she said breathlessly, "through the dust, the leader. His horse has a red handprint on the flank and he wears a vest with silver conchos." "2 feathers," Victor confirmed. "So what?" "The vest," she insisted. "It belonged to the boy, Sparrow. The child I saved from the fever, his mother gave it to him when he recovered." "Sparrow is Black Knife's nephew," Alina said, realization dawning. "If 2 feathers has that vest." "Then he is kin," Mariposa finished. "He is bound by the same laws." Before Victor could stop her, Mariposa threw off the heavy bar. "Mariposa, no!" Victor lunged for her, but she was already through the door, stepping out onto the porch into the swirling maelstrom of dust and smoke. The firing stopped instantly. The sight of a woman standing unarmed in the doorway, hair whipping in the wind, seemed to confuse the attackers. Victor stood in the doorway behind her, his rifle raised, his body shielding hers as much as possible. "Get back inside," he hissed. She ignored him. She raised her voice, pitching it to cut through the howling wind. She didn't speak English. She spoke the Apache tongue she had learned during her captivity. "I am Mariposa," she cried out, "daughter of the healer. I claim the debt of life." A silence fell over the yard, heavier than the storm. A figure emerged from the dust, a massive warrior on a paint horse, 2 feathers. He held a repeater rifle leveled at Mariposa's chest. "The healer is a friend to Black Knife," 2 feathers shouted back in his own language. "But Black Knife is not here, and the settlers have taken our land." "I gave life to the child who wore your vest." Mariposa pointed a shaking finger at the silver conchos. "Sparrow lives because I breathed for him when the spirits tried to take him. Does the great 2 feathers kill the savior of his own blood?" The warrior hesitated, the horse shifted nervously. "And him," Mariposa grabbed Victor's arm, pulling him forward. "This is the water giver, the man who saved your women and children from thirst when he owed them nothing. Is this how Apache honor is repaid?" "With fire and bullets." 2 feathers stared at them, conflict warring on his painted face. The raid was his right, these were encroachers, but the debt of life and water, that was sacred. To kill a savior brought a curse upon the hunter. Suddenly a new sound cut through the wind, a high, piercing whistle from the ridge above the homestead. 2 feathers' head snapped up. Through the thinning dust, silhouettes appeared on the skyline, not soldiers, Apache. Black Knife sat atop his mount on the ridge, a dozen warriors behind him. He did not raise his weapon, he simply sat there, silent and watching. The message was clear: we are watching, the debt holds. Two feathers looked from the ridge to Mariposa and finally to Victor. He lowered his rifle slowly. He spat on the ground, a gesture of frustration but also of acceptance. He barked a command to his men. He turned his horse, looking back once at Victor. "The water is paid," he called out in rough English. "The life is paid, we are done." With a kick of his heels, he vanished back into the dust storm. The other warriors melted away like ghosts. On the ridge, Black Knife raised a hand in silent salute to Victor, then turned and disappeared. Mariposa's knees buckled. Victor caught her before she hit the floorboards, pulling her tight against his chest. They stood there on the porch, the smell of charred wood and ozone filling the air, shaking with the aftershocks of adrenaline. "You foolish, brave woman," Victor whispered into her hair. "You could have been killed." "I knew," she gasped, clutching his shirt. "But I knew we were stronger together. I knew it." The storm broke an hour later, leaving the valley scoured clean and the air unnaturally still. The damage to the homestead was significant: scorched walls, broken fences, a few slaughtered chickens, but the house stood and the family was whole. Victor stood by the porch railing, looking out at the muddy yard. He felt a profound shift within him. For years, he had believed that security came from walls, from fences, from distance. Today, a wall of wood had almost become his coffin. What had saved them wasn't isolation. It was connection. It was a cup of water given months ago. It was a child healed. It was the community of two cultures finding a fragile balance. He turned to see Mariposa emerging from the house with 2 cups of coffee. She looked exhausted, soot smudged on her cheek, her dress torn at the hem. To Victor, she looked like the most magnificent thing on God's earth. She handed him the cup, her hand brushing his. "Thomas says the north wall will need replacing, but the structure is sound." "Mariposa," Victor said, ignoring the coffee. He set the cup on the railing. She looked up, pausing at the intensity of his tone. "Yes. I can't do this anymore." Her face fell slightly. "The danger, I understand, it's too much." "No," he interrupted, stepping closer. "I mean I can't do this, the separate ranches. The riding back and forth, the sleeping in an empty house wondering if you're safe, the waiting." He took her hands, his calloused thumbs tracing the back of her knuckles. "The frontier tried to kill us today," he said, his voice rough. "And it will try again. Drought, blizzards, sickness, raids. I don't want to face any of it without you by my side, not for another hour." Mariposa's breath hitched. "I don't have a ring," Victor said, echoing a thought he'd had many times. "But I have the Crooked M, and I have the O'Brien claim, and I have a love for you that scares the hell out of me because I know I can't survive without it anymore." He looked deep into her violet blue eyes. "Mariposa O'Brien, will you marry me? Will you merge our lands and our lives? Will you build something new with me right here in this dust?" Tears cut tracks through the soot on her face. A smile, radiant and fierce, broke through. "I thought you'd never ask, Victor Macintyre." He kissed her then, desperate and sweet, a seal on a promise made in the shadow of death. Thomas and Alina watched from the window, Thomas grinning as he cleaned his rifle, Alina wiping her eyes with her apron. Epilogue 5 years later. The Arizona sun was setting, painting the sky in strokes of tangerine and violet, but the earth of the valley was no longer parched brown. Victor stood on the porch of the expanded ranch house, a sprawling structure that connected the original O'Brien cabin with a new wing. He looked out over the valley floor. It was green. The diversion channels they had dug from the hidden spring, expanded carefully over the years using Mariposa's plans and Victor's engineering, had transformed the Dust Bowl into a patchwork of thriving gardens and grazing land. The cattle were fat, grazing on alfalfa that shouldn't have grown here but did. Laughter drifted from the garden. A little girl, 3 years old with golden hair and dark eyes, was chasing a butterfly through the rows of medicinal sage. Alina, careful with the herbs. Mariposa called out from where she sat on a bench, holding a sleeping infant. She looked up as Victor approached, her face fuller now, content and glowing in the twilight. "She has your energy," Victor laughed, sitting beside her and putting his arm around her shoulders. "And your stubbornness," Mariposa countered, leaning into him. Victor looked down at the object hanging around his neck. The leather cord was worn now, but the beaded amulet Mariposa had given him, the symbol of water finding a way through stone, was as bright as the day he received it. The community had changed too. The Macintyre O'Brien place had become a hub. Settlers came for Alina's medicines. Victor negotiated disputes over water rights, teaching the valley the lesson he had learned, that hoarding led to death and sharing led to life. Even the Apache bands passed through peacefully now, often stopping to trade goods for the medicinal salves Mariposa brewed. Victor took Mariposa's hand, interlacing their fingers. He thought of his father dead and buried in the dry earth, who had died believing a man stood alone. He looked at his wife, his children, his green valley. "You were right," he whispered to the wind. "You were wrong, Pa, but you would have been glad to see it." "What did you say?" Mariposa asked softly. Victor kissed her temple. "Just thanking the rain," he said, "and the woman who taught me how to catch it."